connecting investors, financial institutions, and businesses around the world. Luxembourg is a center of excellence for global finance. Recognized for its unique international financial expertise, Luxembourg is solution-driven, stable, and open to innovation. A pioneer and global leader in sustainable finance, we help build a better tomorrow today. An international financial center and a European capital. Luxembourg is an exceptional and welcoming place to work and live. Discover what we can do for you.
Welcome to the China Finance Forum, bringing together international experts and practitioners to discuss the macroeconomic, geopolitical and regulatory environment in which the global investment industry is operating.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon and good evening. Wherever you are in the world, a warm welcome to this 9th edition of the China Finance Forum, coming to you from our studio in the European Broadcasting Center in the heart of Luxembourg. My name is Judith Bogner, and once again, I'm truly honored and delighted to lead you through this digital event on behalf of Luxembourg for Finance. First up, we would like to express our gratitude to our sponsors and our media partner, the Financial Times. We also thank all our moderators and speakers for setting aside time to join us and share their insights with us. And we thank all of you who are listening and watching our audience from around the world from some 50 countries. Of course, this will be recorded. The recording will be made available to you. Just look for the email in your inbox after the event is over. It will have a link that will take you right back to the website of Luxembourg for Finance, where you can watch the replay at your leisure. In the year of the dragon, China continues to assert its pivotal role in the global fabric of finance, trade, and economics. And the numbers speak for themselves. China's $18 trillion economy, that's as of the end of 2022, is the second largest on the planet after the United States when measured by nominal GDP, and the largest economy when measured by purchasing power parity. As for Chinese capital markets, we know that its onshore bond market, with a size of about $23 trillion, is again the second largest after the US, and with Chinese equities have seen major outflows since the peak in 2021. Shanghai and Shenzhen are well established among the globe's top stock markets, with a market cap of combined $12 trillion. That's at the end of 2023. And let's not forget, to complete the picture at this point, China is the globe's largest source of development finance, not least thanks to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is now in its 11th year. And we discussed in previous editions of the China Finance Forum that China has embarked on a trajectory of structural recalibration with slower overall growth and what he calls high-quality development that aims to make the economy more innovative, greener, and more balanced. And this trajectory, of course, shapes the opportunities for foreign investors and foreign financial firms in China's domestic markets, and it shapes the strategies of Chinese firms going outbound, investing abroad, looking to take their expertise to other markets, and it shapes also the interests and strategies of Chinese retail investors and institutional investors abroad. So with all the above in mind, we want to explore the following themes over the next 3 hours with our esteemed guests. We start by taking the pulse of the current geopolitical dynamics seen from the United States, and then we'll look at China's economic outlook and assess recent stimulus measures, followed by taking the market perspective and making the case for buying a China-focused fund. Then we'll have a deep dive on the latest innovations in China's capital markets and a discussion on the how and where of Chinese outbound investment. Next up, we'll look at the evolution of cross-border digital payments through the eyes of one of China's leading fintechs in the space. And we'll wrap it up with China's progress in scaling up green finance and aligning with other regions to get to net zero carbon emissions. But first, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Rorry Daniels, Managing Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute, also known as ASPI. Now, in this role, Rorry leads and oversees strategy and operations for ASPI's projects on security, on climate change and trade throughout Asia. She's also a senior fellow of ASPI's Center for China Analysis and is indeed proficient in Mandarin Chinese. Before joining ASPI in June 2022, she served at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, where she managed its Track 2 diplomacy efforts, which is essentially conflict resolution through communication. She also reached her latest research project, audited the US-China strategic and economic dialogue to evaluate its processes and outcomes. And she also regularly writes and provides analysis for major media outlets and newsletters on security issues regarding the US and the Asia-Pacific region. And I want to add that I find it highly educational to listen to Rorry moderating ASPI's signature podcast, which is called Asia Inside Out, which provides an insider view on the Asia-Pacific region through the eyes of informed experts and decision makers. So today, Rorry Daniels joins us from New York to give us her perspective and the US perspective, indeed, on China's journey a quarter of the way through the 21st century and share her thoughts on the future trajectory of the relationship between the United States and China, specifically in the wake of the recent US presidential elections. So a warm welcome to you, Rorry. It's great to have you with us, and I hand you the floor.
Thank you, Judith, for that warm introduction. It's truly my pleasure to be here today at the China Finance Forum to talk about issues that I think are critically important to understanding the future of the 21st century, namely how US-China relations have evolved over the last 25 years, what China wants in the international system, and what that means for international relations and international economy going forward. My bottom line up front is that China over the last 25 years has moved from prioritizing economic growth to prioritizing security, particularly regime security. In order to do so, or because it's doing so, it's preserving options in the international system and it's shifting its social contract at home. Chinese leadership feels simultaneously boosted by their long-term economic prospects and performance and anxious that a slowdown in economic growth will damage their social contract. So I'm going to talk through the story of this first quarter of the 21st century and lay out my thoughts for what this means for China and US-China relations going forward. First, where does China's foreign policy originate? From my perspective, it comes from the interplay of the party, the state, and the market. And each of these entities have been given different responsibilities over time to achieve China's goals. China's a fascinating study in how to split the difference between a non-democratic one-party system and a market economy. Since reform and opening was established as China's driving vision, three forces have been interacting within China to hold, grow, and use power. The Communist Party of China, which sets policy direction, the state, which implements policy directives from the party, and the market, which grows China's economy in ways that provide legitimacy to the party-state system. The story of how these systems have evolved in tandem tells much about how China has interacted with the outside world. Actually, the phenomenon that most of us have associated with China, a rapidly growing economy and a rapidly rising superpower, is in fact a very short-lived and perhaps exceptional period. 25 years ago, at the turn of the 21st century, China was only at the beginning of the transfer of wealth of power from solely in the hands of the party state to being diffused throughout society and throughout the world. This process started internally with moves like creating a private property market by granting homes to employees of state or state-owned enterprises. As private investment began to find areas of development inside China, the party state allowed a lot of local experimentation with raising and lending capital. This all accelerated when China acceded to the WTO, which jump-started its international trade and investment. The party state at this time was governed by consensus and technocrats. Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao
where leaders focused on growing China's wealth to reinvest it in the country's development. They shaped Communist Party ideology and directives toward this end, with policies like the Three Represents, which gave entrepreneurs an important and endorsed role in China's economic strategy, and the Scientific Outlook on Development, which as early as 2003 sought to provide a pathway to higher quality economic development and engagement by emphasizing balance and sustainability. In other words, transcending a development model reliant on unskilled manufacturing labor for a more stratified model. This enabled a lot more local experimentation with how to improve the quality of development, but it didn't shift the overall goal of wealth gain and capture. Both of these guiding theories were presented as the continuation of party goals since its founding in 1949. Both also enabled, however, sea changes in the social compact between state and society, as private actors and local officials were not only allowed, but encouraged to grow their wealth to contribute to China's overarching development plan. China's foreign policy in this period was likewise technocratic and expansive. Officials in the Foreign Service actively sought opportunities to link China's economic trajectory with the outside world. In the period from 2001 to roughly 2015, China became the engine of an enormous globalization process by positioning itself as the fulcrum between the developing and the developed world. It imported raw materials and goods from less developed countries, brought them to China to manufacture into finished goods, and exported those goods to the developed country markets. There were two main features of China's foreign policy in this period. First, the focus on economic connections meant that Chinese officials pursued very pragmatic political goals. On principle, China has always resolutely defended its core interests, which include peaceful development, preservation of its political system, territorial integrity, including over Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, and Tibet, as well as its maritime territorial claims in the East and South China Seas. And I think we could add non-alignment and non-interference of domestic affairs of other countries into this mix. But while China would never stray from these as ultimate objectives, it did prioritize economic engagements, in some cases as a means to its ultimate aims. Take Taiwan, for example. In the mid to late aughts, Taipei and Beijing reached a very flexible consensus on how they could refer to each other politically. The so-called 1992 consensus, in which both sides acknowledge there's only one China, but agree to disagree on who represents that China. And this consensus enabled a series of economic agreements that further boosted cross-strait trade and investment. At this time, Beijing's policy toward Taiwan of peaceful integration was enacted through these growing social and economic ties. The politics of the party, the state, and the market were well aligned, and there was a sense that Taiwan would come back to China without a fight through joint market development and integration. The second feature of Chinese foreign policy in this era, when it was prioritizing economic growth, was that officials were given a long leash to pursue cooperation with economic benefits. While political negotiation was still very tightly controlled by top leadership in Beijing, the same experimentation that was acceptable for local officials was extended to Beijing's diplomats and experts abroad. The guiding call was to bring knowledge and resources into China so it could improve the pace and quality of its development in line with the Scientific Outlook on Development. This encapsulated a golden period for China's ties with the outside world, and particularly with the US. The US and China established a pattern of diplomacy that became the Strategic and Economic Dialogue, or SNED. The SNED, which really gained steam after the 2008 global financial crisis, was a whole-of-government effort to coordinate bilateral policy measures. Significantly, it contained multitudes of people-to-people exchanges across various topics of expertise, from climate mitigation and adaptation to the peaceful use of nuclear materials in science and technology. China was using its economic attractiveness and its political pragmatism to bring in the knowledge and training it would need to move up the economic value chain. And it wanted to move up the economic value chain to maintain its internal social compact. The government would concentrate on improving people's lives through economic development, and the people would be compliant to Beijing's political goals and campaigns. But other trends were taking place at the same time that would feed into party doctrine as pivotal moments in China's geostrategic outlook. The global financial crisis, for example, coincided with the Beijing Olympics, which in many ways was a public test of whether China's strategy to develop itself in line with major powers was working. Internally, the Olympics tested that social contract as China displaced citizens of Beijing in massive cleanup campaigns of the city's historic hutong or alleyway districts, which were seen by leadership as pre-modern and embarrassing to showcase to foreign guests. On the global stage, China was able to display, particularly through the stadium development and its opening ceremony, the technocratic expertise and its ability to create massive projects, even art at an immense scale. The 2008 Olympics began to change expectations in Beijing and across China about where it fit with the rest of the world. Suddenly, there was proof that China was developing well, that the strategic bets made by the party were working, and that the Chinese people could take pride in being a critical part of this economic miracle. The global financial crisis exacerbated this sense of China's ascendancy by putting a marker down on Western decline, particularly one that was interpreted as, one, based on excess, and two, where China could see itself as the savior of global macroeconomic stability. Again, expectations were rising that China now had enough power to play tough on the international stage and to expand that power toward goals it had sidelined, particularly its security goals. At the same time, this rapid rise of China's economy left significant room for corruption. The scope and scale of corrupt activities has been extensively documented elsewhere, but it started to stress the social compact as China's ordinary people had most contact with the corrupt local officials who were seen as preying on the local population for their own benefit. And one can guess that inner China corruption likely intensified intra-party factionalism as differing groups used the existence of an exposure to corruption to jockey for political power. Meanwhile, in this period, say roughly 2010 to 2015, the developed world was starting to turn against the process of unfettered globalization as its downside impacts, including income inequality, loss of domestic labor markets, and negative climate effects, began reverberating through domestic politics. So at the same time the developed world was wanting to slow the process of globalization, China was both feeling the effects of those downside impacts as well as perhaps overstretched into global investment and expansion. Its social contract was hollowed out, and dissatisfaction with and among political elites was high. New centers of power were developing in the market in China outside of the party's reach. New technologies were allowing the Chinese people greater access to information about the world and therefore greater criticism of China's quiet approach to international relations. Enter Xi Jinping. Over the last decade plus, Xi Jinping has assessed the trajectory of this domestic political economy and attempted to correct for these changes by reestablishing the dominance of the party over the state and market. I see this reemphasis as partially pragmatic, an adjustment to changing trends in China and the world, and partially strategic to maintain one-party control through a period of international upheaval and turbulence. Xi Jinping is more in the style of a Mao or a Deng than a Hu Jintao or a Jiang Zemin, both of whom he seems to regard as ineffective leaders who let manageable problems grow out of control. He's a campaigner. He likes big, broad brush projects like Made in China 2025, the Belt and Road Initiative, and the latest trio, the Global Development Initiative, GDI, the Global Security Initiative, GSI, and the Global Civilization Initiatives, GCI. At home, he's launched a perpetual anti-corruption campaign, which provides a lot of help to Chinese citizens dealing with corrupt local officials, but also opportunities to purge political rivals and consolidate power. He tells the Chinese people to prepare for struggle as he seeks to use China's now considerable power to pursue a less pragmatic, more full-throated, and sometimes confrontational foreign policy. There are plenty of adjustments on the margins. For example, the disappearance of Made in China 2025 or the curtailing of so-called wolf warrior diplomacy that saw Chinese officials abroad making incendiary comments online and impress availability. But overall, Xi Jinping is steering the China ship in a different direction because he and the Chinese leadership feel China has arrived and their social contract requires new directions of gain, including in the international space. But Xi Jinping's foreign policy still has its own contradictions. On the one hand, the Xi Jinping regime seems to believe in a sweeping correlation of forces throughout history that says the West is declining and the East is rising, and eventually there'll be a formal takeover in global power. On the other hand, China recognizes that it still has significant development and governance issues to address domestically, and that it needs the somewhat benign external environment that the international base rules order provides. And the US alliance network creates a powerful and potentially damaging counterbalance to the use of Chinese force and coercion to effect its political goals. China still positions and sees itself as a champion of the developing world, even as it finds it more difficult to convince the developed economies of the West that it deserves special treatment in line with its developing country status. And as globalization slowed, China has used its considerable economic reach in many politically coercive ways. Some of these are naked political grabs, such as when it targets specific imports for punishment over political disputes, as it did by formally banning Canadian canola oil, for example, over Canada's decision to hold a Huawei exec on behalf of the United States. So China is using its power in order to further its political goals in new ways. It's doing this through its economic power. It's also using newfound military modernization and security power to do this. It is more aggressively defending what it sees as its maritime territorial claims in the East and South China Sea. It is using coercive economic, social, and political power to try to bring Taiwan back into the fold after Taiwan's body politic rejected the direction of cross-Taiwan Strait relations as becoming too politically close to Beijing. And it's doing so at a time when its relationship with the US is going up and down like a roller coaster. China, I think, was almost as surprised as the rest of the world at the first election of Donald Trump in 2016, and perhaps even more surprised that the first Trump administration was willing to radically change the direction of US-China policy in pursuit of strategic competition. The first Trump administration took channels of dialogue between the US and China from over, let's say, 100 down to just 4. And China policy was very tightly controlled at the top of the leadership chain by Donald Trump himself and his key advisors. This really created an instance where Beijing could no longer count on official-to-official relationships at the lower levels being able to calm tensions, manage misperceptions, or move the needle in US-China relations. Instead, Beijing had to concentrate on working at the very top through the channel between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump himself in order to keep the relationship stable. This is likely to happen again as Donald Trump is now re-entering the White House next January. The key dynamic for China will be how will Donald Trump pursue his trade and tariff strategy, the cornerstone of his sense of economic geostrategic competition, in order to reshape US-China relations. Simultaneously, Donald Trump's advisors are likely to follow a bipartisan Washington consensus to be quite tough on China in this era. No longer is China seen as the engine of globalization. Instead, due to the practices of China to use its power coercively in the world, the United States now looks at China as a geostrategic rival and potentially an enemy. This competition will be playing out, however, in the context of a new global environment that is more multipolar in nature than it has ever been. And again, as I said at the beginning, in this environment, China wants to preserve its options. The United States and the Biden administration did try to take as many steps as possible to re-establish links of communication at lower levels in order to stabilize the relationship and to move it forward across many different fronts, not solely on the priorities and objectives of the president himself. However, efforts to do so stalled because China was not ready to take a bet on the Biden administration, knowing that the political partisanship in the United States was likely to swing wildly back and forth. They do see a bipartisan consensus on getting tough on China as permanent and irreplaceable, and no chance for softening anytime soon. So when Xi Jinping tells his people to prepare for struggle, in some ways he is marking for them that there is not going to be a change in the overall US-China relationship, at least not in the near term. Simply put, the security objectives of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party and the international objectives of the United States and the international rules-based order don't meet well together in the middle. There are many opportunities for clashes, and managing this relationship well is probably the outcome that we can hope for and work toward in the coming years. That said, there are reasons that China may want to moderate its approach to security issues. China, particularly after COVID, suffered a downturn in its own people's sense of its governance performance. The white paper protests that eventually lifted COVID controls were a culmination of minor irritants that had been building up in Chinese society over the years as Xi Jinping's campaigns to radically change the way that the Chinese system distributes wealth and power have faltered and have met resistance inside Chinese society. Chinese young people, where youth unemployment is at an all-time high, are choosing to, quote, lie flat and not participate in economic activities that they may be available for but not interested in. The birth rate is falling. Chinese women don't want to have babies in an incredibly competitive educational environment, and one where they're feeling under stress for wages, jobs, and for real estate. So there are things going on inside China that require Xi Jinping to recalibrate. And the question is simply, how will this recalibration happen and in what time frame? Xi Jinping knows, and I think the Chinese leadership know, that the greatest challenge in China right now is keeping wealth and people in the country as the world moves into a flatter system. But at the same time, this extreme attention on security and regime security, the curtailing and public embarrassment that Xi Jinping and his regime have enacted on key Chinese business people have scared Chinese business people and Chinese entrepreneurs and the private market in general from taking advantage of some of the things that China has offered to sweeten the deal of investing in China. It remains to be seen if the new stimulus package to be announced soon will be able to kind of correct for this disengagement among China's business elite. In short, neither Chinese business elite and neither would Chinese officials want to stick their neck out right now at a time when Xi Jinping and the top leadership in Beijing are systematically going around chopping off heads. However, the Chinese leadership knows that it needs this push and pull of allowing private capital to flourish and creating systems in place that consolidate party control to work in tandem with each other. And that means there are still opportunities to invest in China. At the same time, those opportunities are very politically prescribed, and paying attention to Xi Jinping himself, his Xi Jinping thought, the directives that are given out to the party as party doctrine, and also the key statements of leaders, and particularly in international fora, will be key to understanding what is politically appropriate to do in China at this time and what China's political goals are. China would certainly like to move up the economic value chain in tech and sustainability. These are areas that Xi Jinping has identified and the Chinese leadership have identified as key areas for China's innovation economy moving forward and the way that China's economy can grow and strengthen over time. This has obviously created a lot of tension with the United States, which would like itself to be a leader in tech innovation, and has concerns that the way China is pursuing its sustainability leadership, for example, the overproduction of electric vehicles, electric vehicle batteries, photovoltaic cells, will impact market competitiveness for US and Western firms over time. Coupled with the pattern of behavior from China to use its economic power coercively, particularly when it holds a lot of the choke points of the international supply chain is giving the United States and the countries of the West great pause in thinking about how to create resiliency in the global supply chain. Meanwhile, China has, inside its country, used nationalism to hold people together through this struggle. The social compact is changing, in which Chinese people expect their government to more vigorously defend its so-called core interests, including Taiwan, the East and South China Seas, and other territorial integrity issues. Again, this is bringing China into direct competition and conflict with the US and its allies, who are the main territorial claimants to the disputed areas. At the same time, the Biden administration found that US-China relations over the period from 2020 to 24 could not move the needle for China on its relationship with US adversaries. When the US looks at the Beijing-Moscow relationship, when it looks at Beijing's relationship with North Korea and Pyongyang, when it looks at the Iran relationship, when it looks at Beijing's statements perhaps on the Middle East, the current conflict between Israel and Hamas, which is widening into a neighborhood conflict, it really doesn't see any room for China to align with US priorities. And I think the US is quite upset about that. It sees China as stymieing the ending of some of these conflicts by providing material and rhetorical support to malicious actors, particularly to Vladimir Putin. However, I see China as wanting to preserve options in a multipolar world. China still sees the West, and particularly the US, as its largest competitor for economic innovation economy over the next 25 years. It wants to be able to have enough friends in the international space, or at least acquaintances that it can count on in a crunch, that it can weather any storms that the US and the developed world can bring against China for its own behavior. China's not alone in seeking options. If you look at countries like India, you will also see that there are areas where India and the United States can work together quite cooperatively, where India wants to better align with the West, and there are some areas where India wants to preserve its options in the international space. China is doing the same thing, but it does bring into conflict the US and China's relationship, at least over the past 4 years. Moving forward might be quite a different story. President-elect Donald Trump seems to understand the quest for options in the international space. I would characterize his first term as one of no friends, no enemies, and no apologies. And I think that that more closely aligns with Beijing's worldview. So it remains to be seen how US and China relations will move over the next 4 years. Donald Trump is likely to have advisors that are quite tough on China, that want to pursue strategic competition all the way to the collapse of the Chinese regime. But at the same time, I think Donald Trump himself has very little interest in the pursuit of grand political schemes and objectives. He looks at the bottom line, almost in a profit and loss way, and says, are we gaining as much from this relationship as we are investing in it? That could be manageable over the next 4 years. Over the longer term, the question is simply, how will the US support its allies abroad in ways that interact with Chinese objectives? Will we see political swings in the United States back towards an alliance-centered mechanism for managing our international interests? Or will the current trajectory of seeking alliances as transactional relationships continue? And in that world, will allies themselves pull themselves together as a counterbalancing force to China's coercive use of power? What would be productive, and where I think we need to go, is to imagine a world in which the US and China peacefully coexist as major powers. In such a world, the US and China would use dialogue and diplomacy to manage their disputes, would seek international coalition building in order to solve major questions and issues of our time, particularly the questions of climate change, international global public health, and macroeconomic stability. This world is available to us as long as we prioritize those issues over some of the issues where we disagree, particularly the future of Taiwan and these maritime territorial disputes, as well as the future of the U.S. alliance network. But as long as international investors are interested in participating in China, China will remain open for business. And I think that as long as that international investment community can help both governments across the world better understand China's priorities, how they're shifting, what its social contract means for its international policy, we have a very good chance of achieving a future in which there is no major conflict between the US and China that derails the peace and prosperity that we have seen over the last 25 or 30 years in major power relations. So I leave you with that thought that you have an important role to play in managing this relationship over time. Thank you so much for having me today, and I'll turn it back over to Judith now.
Thank you so much, Rorry, for sharing the U.S. perspective on China's geopolitical dynamics and giving us an outlook for the future relationship between China and the United States going forward. Now, Rorry emphasized the importance of the Chinese economy, and I'd love to add some data to give us really an idea of China's economic might in a global context. Bloomberg calculations based on IMF data show that China will likely be the top contributor to global GDP going forward. To put that into numbers, between 2024 and 5 years down the road, 2029, it will account for about 21% of the world's new economic activity. That compares with only 20% for all of the G7 countries and is almost double the nearly 12% for the United States. So to help us understand and make sense of Chinese recent stimulus measures and understand China's current macroeconomic outlook, I have the pleasure to welcome back Chahine, who's joining us now from London. Now, Chahine is Chief China Economist with ICBC Standard Bank and leads its China Macro Research team. Under her leadership, her team launched the Belt and Road Economics Research Series, which offers unique insights into China's growing connectivity across the emerging economies. Prior to joining ICBC Standard in early 2016, Chahine served for almost 10 years at Standard Chartered Bank, also in London. And as a leading voice on China's economy and renminbi internationalization, Chahine is also a regular guest speaker in the financial media and also at high-level conferences. So warm welcome back to you, Chahine. Please help us to understand China's current macroeconomic outlook going forward into 2025, and also what the reasoning is of policymakers and regulators in regards to recent stimulus measures. So you have the floor, Chahine.
Thank you so much, Judith, for that introduction, and it's absolutely a pleasure to be back. What an interesting time it is to update you on China's macroeconomic outlook, and in particular, where China sits in the current global environment. Now, as we all know, China is going through a very challenging set of transition, not just in terms of where it is on the cycle and facing lots of uncertainties, particularly facing geopolitics, but also more importantly, China is transitioning towards the next stage of growth, one that is less driven by investment and net exports, but more driven by consumption. And to understand that, what I wanted to share with you today is my top 3 Ds for understanding where China is and perhaps where China is going, to help investors understand where may the opportunities lie, but also where may the risks be. Number 1 D is de-risking. In a nutshell, all of the stimulus policies that we've seen so far is about de-risking the economy. China is going through structural changes, an aging population, facing huge amounts of burden of debt, particularly local government debt. And one of the key reasons that the policy shift has really seen a dramatic shift away from just relying very much on loose monetary policy towards one of very proactive fiscal policy. The recent fiscal package tells us that there is still a lot of distress at the local government level. And therefore, the current fiscal program is really to help provincial governments, to give them breadth and give them room to be able to invest. And a lot of that is about de-risking the economy. There's a long journey to go, but certainly the realization and the commitment to de-risking the economy and going forward, and that is an important step. So my first D today is de-risk. Number 2D is an interesting one, is dynamism. Now, as I mentioned, as China embarks on this journey towards a consumption-led economy, what has become more and more apparent is that demand-side policies need to come to the fore. Now, your previous speaker talked about expanding the supply chains. So a lot of the supply side policies have so far worked very well, and increasingly is still a focus. But what might become more of a focus for policymakers is to how to stimulate demand. And demand very much comes from different aspects. And of course, we know at a holistic level, China has always been a big consumer of global commodities. And increasingly so, as we face uncertainties in terms of global trade and also changing partners in global trade. What may become very interesting to watch is not only who China trades with, what China consumes, but increasingly how China's domestic demand shapes up. So how does China unlock spending within China itself? So domestic capacity. So the dynamism comes in terms of how to really invigorate and unlock spending by setting forth a set of policies that don't only address at the very aggregate level, so how to make sure that cost of funding is low, at the fiscal level, help governments to spend, and thereby help corporates and individuals to spend. And really watching data going forward, not only official data, but high frequency leading indicator, so to tell us how to adjust current policies to really focus at the weaker sides of economies. So which target audience needs more work? So dynamic emphasis of what policies need to come to the fore and to really pick up, the pace of encouraging more and more spending is going to increasingly be a focus for policymakers. We have already seen that. We know that growth has really been a challenging area. And of course, the target is still very much for 5% GDP growth. And it may be the case for another year, if not longer. And the key reason is that 5% GDP growth is necessary, particularly to keep unemployment low, to ensure that the economy really has a very stable trajectory. And at the current level of growth, it is obviously key for the key areas of growth, particularly investment, particularly manufacturing and increasingly high-end manufacturing to become a focus for investment. Now, large corporates are doing better than smaller corporates. So the dynamic set of policy making needs to ensure that smaller and micro enterprises are doing just as well, if not better, in the coming months to really catch up. So recent data is showing us we're slowly seeing a recovery in terms of PMIs, purchase and manufacture indices, both at the manufacturing level and services level. So we're seeing expansion, particularly in terms of manufacturers' awareness. So export orders are starting to recover. We may start to see orders coming in domestically also, because people are starting to see that the stimulus package is starting to have a meaningful effect on the real economy. But more is needed and more time is needed to realize where are still the pockets of weakness that policymakers need to focus on. So my second D is very much dynamism or dynamic policy making. Last but not least is diversification. We know from a global perspective, particularly as portfolio managers seek diversification, we know with dollar strength, with gold strength, that obviously these are some of the themes coming through in recent months and years. However, will that last? And will there still be a safe haven asset-seeking mentality, particularly as geopolitics unravel? One would imagine that that will still continue to be the case, especially as a new US president starts to announce sets of policy making. And of course, as China still continues to focus on stabilizing growth. So at least for a few months yet, and certainly early 2025, we may see that the focus for China's policymakers will be growth. And yes, security and other measures, and this is where I will bring in a very popular catchphrase in China, which is the two majors and two news. The two majors really are, in terms of strategy and in terms of security, food and energy security. The two news very much focuses on upgrading industries towards high-end manufacturing, but also upgrading of consumption. So when we talk about this is where the diversification comes in. I think previously the market is very aware that the economy very much relied on investments, hard infrastructure investments, and certainly ones funded by the central government. Local governments obviously had a role to play, but because of a dependency on various sectors, such as the property sectors, and whereby local governments relied on revenue sources from land sales, so there tended to be an over-reliance on the property sector, construction sector, and these very traditional areas of the sector that did very much pull up economic growth. However, the diversification domestically comes in that because of the recent policies to really focus more on innovation-driven, high-end manufacturing and technology-driven sectors, and that will really shift China's current manufacturing capacity towards one of high quality growth and moving up the value curve, so that China doesn't just produce low cost or low end or ones that really relies on China to reproduce, but also ones where China are producing some of the key brands globally. So electric vehicles certainly, but increasingly China is innovating in other sectors, a multitude of sectors. So I think what will really define China's moment in 2025 is how data is telling us that China's sectors are diversifying. Chinese brands in various sectors globally are diversifying. And diversification in terms of renminbi diversification and renminbi internationalization. The internationalization of the currency has really allowed the currency not only to be a trade settlement currency, and increasingly as a unit of account, lots of denomination into RMB denominated assets, but increasingly as a reserve currency. So global investors are increasingly looking to renminbi-denominated assets, so government bonds and, of course, foreign currency, etc., in terms of an anchor for portfolio management and for reserves. And the reason for that is a relative lack of correlation to, first of all, global markets, and increasingly also the cyclicality of the performance of the economy. In the longer run, of course, appreciation of the currency is still very much to be expected, given fundamentals in that China is still one of the outperformers in the global economy and continues to have a stable growth trajectory. Now, diversification means that the performance of the economy still needs to be very much stable and outperform relative to economies that are at a similar size. And at the moment, obviously, China as the second largest economy is the only other comparison in terms of size is the US. But the growth of the economy in terms of dynamism actually compares China very much so with other emerging markets. In terms of overall size, probably not as big as China, but in terms of the potential growth, in terms of population growth, etc., China is facing increasing challenges on a structural level when compared to other peers and other emerging markets. So diversification really comes with an additional emphasis on how China increasingly looks towards other trading partners and also other investors. China investing, of course, in infrastructure and, in terms of foreign direct investment in other partners, trading increasingly with emerging economies, so the South-South trade corridor is becoming more and more active. But increasingly, in terms of portfolio flows, we see China also increasingly investing into these emerging markets and vice versa. Emerging markets looking for Chinese investments or renminbi-denominated assets as investment to anchor and diversify its own reserves. So 3Ds, one more time, I wanted to emphasize, and really sums up the outlook for China's economy and its relationship with the world, is number one, de-risking the economy in order to help China fulfill its current structural transition towards a consumption-based economy, unlocking savings, particularly households and individuals. And when we look at recent policies, particularly focused at bringing down the cost of spending for corporates and for individuals, that in a nutshell sums up some of these stimulus policies or so-called stimulus policies that really facilitate consumption in the real economy. Consumption not just at an aggregate level by large corporates, by the central government, but by de-risking the balance sheets of local governments. The hope is that this will unlock spending to and investment at the local government level and also at the household level. And secondly, dynamic policy making. Dynamism comes in a range of scopes within China's current economic outlook. Dynamic policy making means that whilst balancing a loose monetary policy making and also new monetary policy tools aimed at not just bringing down the overall cost of funding and borrowing, and of course, interbank, making sure there is ample liquidity for major banks and smaller banks at the same time to ensure that there is plenty of liquidity in the overall economy to facilitate the activities around the economy. But ultimately, new instrument tools to really target the pockets of the economy that really needs it, to channel that liquidity. And of course, recent instruments, for example, the corridor and usage of a 7-day repo, for example, or other shorter tenor instruments, of course, the LPR, the loan prime ratio, for example, and more rates pegged to that, means that the policymakers, particularly the PBOC central banks, are thinking of new and innovative ways to dynamically think about where to channel that liquidity in the economy to ensure that the beneficiaries of the current stimulus policy is very much comprehensive and holistic. And de-risking and dynamism really go hand to hand. So a lot of this policy or stimulus policy focusing at the aggregate level and at the household level really means a lot of policies come in simultaneously. And as we head into the December Central Economic Work Meeting, where some of the key targets for 2025 will be set, and as we head into the 2 sessions in March, investors will clearly be watching for more signs of what more stimulus policies and what other innovative ideas policymakers will have to really ensure that the activism and the current pace of recovery in China's economic growth still continues to bring. And what else do we have in terms of, how sustainable this current pace of recovery will be? So de-risking, dynamism, and last but not least, diversification. The diversification of the 2 majors, 2 news, so major security issues, major strategies, and the new areas of upgrading manufacturing capacity, upgrading of consumption, diversification into various sectors, away from being concentrated at certain levels. And we do absolutely have new areas where Chinese corporates have competitive advantage globally. But even that, China cannot be complacent. So new areas where China can really demonstrate competitiveness and also look towards increasing number of trading partners and of course investor partners to really extend that diversification. And of course, in a financial and capital market setting, how the currency and the internationalization and the status of a reserve currency really benefits China's domestic economy. Now, China, as it heads towards the 15th five-year plan, it is likely that the absolute size of the economy will become one of the largest. It already is one of the largest. Will it become the #1 biggest economy in the world? Now, with that comes a lot of responsibilities. So, of course, with a growing economy, but with an aging population, with structural shifts, but challenges that will continue to weigh on the current economic cycle, that 5% growth will be less dependent on the quantity of growth, but more on the quality of growth. So policymakers, whilst continuing to stabilize GDP growth, will also focus on where that growth is coming from and what is the quality of that growth. So what I'm continuing to watch out for are signs that not only central governments, but local governments are increasingly being assessed not only by how much they can help the GDP to grow, but by where that GDP is coming from. So as I mentioned several times already, consumption and unlocking individual consumption, household consumption is important. But where is that GDP coming from has a profound meaning for the sustainability of China's economic growth model going forward. So productivity, green growth, sustainable growth. For China's economy to really transition healthily into the next stage of growth, China really will focus increasingly on quality over quantity. So I look forward to updating you one more time, but certainly for this year, for me, the 3Ds, de-risking, dynamism, and diversification.
Thank you so much, Ginny Yan. They're really breaking down for us China's economic outlook and the reasoning behind the recent stimulus measures. Now, these measures had quite an impact in financial markets and not just in China. Allow me to briefly recap the short-term reaction that were observed by international market commentators. Now, when the measures were announced in late September, the CSI 300 registered amounts of 13%. And overall, mainland and also Hong Kong equities had the best weekly performance since all the way back to November 2008. And were echoed also by gains in leading indices in other parts of the world, such as in the US and in Europe. And as market reports, for example, in the FT and on Bloomberg noted, the rally was driven by both domestic and international investors, some of whom rotated from Asia into Chinese markets. And then after the national holiday in early October, market observers spoke of, and I quote, high volatility, but with slower gains, and still continued strong interest in Chinese stocks. So our first panel today will help us make sense of, if you will, the longer more market perspective with the more high-level view, and also make the case for buying a China-focused fund. And as moderator for this panel, I have the pleasure to introduce you to Danny Howell. Danny joins us from Hong Kong, and he has some 25 years of experience in Asian financial markets under his belt, with a focus on wealth and asset management. Back in Australia, where Dan is originally from, he served for many years at the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, and before that at the National Australia Bank. More recently, he took on the role as managing director for APAC at Lemanik Asset Management in Hong Kong. Now, Lemanik originally is a Luxembourg fund specialist that was established as a European family office in the 1970s. It has since evolved into a broader asset and wealth management, distribution services, and fund services group. So, warm welcome to the China Finance Forum, Dan, and I hand it over to you and your panel.
Thank you, Judith, for your very kind introduction. Look, it's great to be here, and what a wonderful topic to speak about, the case for buying a China-focused fund. As you've mentioned, Judith, in your introduction, clearly it's a market that's generating a lot of interest. The market's been very robust year to date, but there's a lot of risk and uncertainty that overlays the market. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion today with a wonderful group of panelists to delve into the China market and to provide some insights into potential investors into that market. So we have a very highly esteemed and deeply experienced panel of China asset management practitioners, which is wonderful, and they're going to provide these valuable insights into the opportunities and risks that are related to investing into the China market. So without further ado, I'd like to briefly introduce our esteemed panel. Firstly, we have Himalee Bahl from Fidelity. So Himalee is an investment director at Fidelity International, very deeply experienced with 24 years in financial services, 18 of which have been with Fidelity. She's a key and integral part of Fidelity's Asia Pacific equity team and engages with clients across all channels and all geographies. So very delighted to have Himalee with us today. Next, we have Mrs. Ning from Fullgoal. Jun is Deputy Director, Overseas Equity of the Investment Department for the Fullgoal Fund. Jun, again, very deeply experienced asset manager, 13 years experience in equity research and investment, and herself actually currently manages a portfolio of some US 15 billion, which includes the very well-regarded and awarded China Small Mid-Cap Growth Fund within Fullgoal. So I'm very much looking forward to Jun's unique insights, I think, into the market, particularly from a small and mid-cap perspective. And finally, I'm very happy to introduce our third panellist for today's discussion, Mr. Richard Pan from ChinaAMC. So Richard's the Managing Director and Chief Investment Officer of the Global Capital Investment at ChinaAMC. Is the head of the international business at ChinaAMC and the chairman of the ESG committee at ChinaAMC. Now, Richard has a wealth of investment experience with 26 years in investment, 11 of which have been at ChinaAMC. And particularly relevant, I think, to our topic today, Richard leads ChinaAMC's Global Capital Investment Division, the GCI division, which helps actually overseas investors like central banks, global institutions, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and many more invest into China's economy. So wonderful to have this panel with us here today. So thank you all again, panelists, for coming into this discussion, the case for buying a China-focused fund. I'd like to open the first question with Richard and just simply put to hear from you, Richard, what are the reasons for investing into China now? And I know, as I mentioned, you have discussions and you enter into this topic with the clients that you speak to in terms of the GCI. These are sophisticated clients, global clients. I'd love to hear the sorts of topics that you cover with these clients when they're contemplating investing into the China market. And of course, I'm sure there'll be some sort of context of the China policy, both the current policy and what you view to be the policy context going forward. And of course, as I mentioned, and Judith has mentioned, the outcome of the US election, the impact there. And really, I think investors are very interested into the signs that are emerging in the market in terms of market upside. So over to you, Richard. Very interested to hear your views.
Thank you for your question. It's actually a very big question. It's more than several questions. So let me answer the first question. Why China right now? My understanding is this is whatever it takes moment for Chinese government. Chinese government's support to the equity market and to the entire economy is very decisive. It has never ever seen before in the last 1 decade. In September 24th, the governor of PBOC announced to provide 500 billion RMB credit to the listed companies to buy back shares, also encourage the major shareholders to increase their stake in the public equities. And also, the Ministry of Finance will launch a 10 trillion RMB rescue plan, stimulus package plan to rescue the local government debt. Also, Minister of Commerce is implementing a trade-up policy for Chinese home appliance companies to encourage domestic consumptions. Also, in the real estate sector, the down payment has been lowered to historical low, and we expect more policies will be launched, especially on the consumption side. So overall speaking, we believe this time around, Chinese government is very serious. They understand the importance of the economic growth, especially for sustainable growth, especially at this moment, just right after the U.S. election. So we think the more policies pro-economy policies will be launched in the next 3 to 6 months. So I never ever doubt about the determination of Chinese government at this moment. It's on the policy side. Also, on the real economy side, we expect the GDP will begin to recover in the first quarter of next year, and the corporate earnings also will recover in the next year. However, there are still a lot of doubts about the policy effect. So how Chinese policies will have positive impact on the real economy is uncertain. This kind of uncertainties has been shared by a lot of global investors. So when we talk about economic growth in China at this moment, most of global investors still has sort of concern. However, they are at this moment, they began to listen to us. They began to pay more economy and the Chinese equity market. And one thing I think is very interesting, or one thing I want to point out is from top-down perspective, if you look at the total market cap versus China's GDP is only 90%, which means China's equity market is only 90% of China's GDP. And if you look at the US market, the entire US market is more than 2 times as US GDP. Also, if you look at MSCI equity, China is only accounted for less than 3%, and the entire US equity is more than 60%. So, which means, as we know, the China economy is around 18% of global economy. However, in the index, it's below 3%, and also valuation, CSI 300 is only 12 times PE ratio, and S&P 500 is more than 24 times PE ratio. And also earnings growth for CSI 300, we believe will begin to recover in the next year. And also the whole economy, the China's economy, has been successfully transforming from investment-driven, export-driven economy to innovation, especially domestic consumption-driven economy. It will take some time, but my understanding is everything is on the right track, is moving to the right direction. And as you mentioned about how China's respond to U.S. Presidential election, my understanding is in the last 1 month or in the last 2 months, you have already seen what Chinese government respond. It's whatever it takes moment for Chinese government, and we expect more policies will be launched. And if you look at the daily turnover of Chinese equity market, this is a very good indicator. So right now, the daily turnover of China equity market is more than $300 billion $300 billion daily turnover, which is almost the highest one globally. Think about China equity market, the total market cap is only around $15 trillion. So I think that's quite encouraging. That's very encouraging. And we expect more and more investors will not only look at this market, but will put the real money in this market in the next 3 to 6 months.
Thank you very much for those comments. That's very insightful indeed. Great to hear you have an optimistic view, and I think it's well founded in those views that you put forward. I think a couple of points quite interesting. The commitment and determination from a policy perspective from the Chinese government, a really interesting point, and that will carry forward into the medium to long term as well. Interesting point around that, you mentioned the uncertain outcomes, and so there's a watching brief on the market in terms of the impacts of those policy stimulatory measures on outcomes within the market. And then clearly the capacity for growth within the market overall. So a wonderful response. And that last point, capacity for growth in terms of benchmarking absolute size of the market in terms of market cap and ratios with GDP and others. Wonderful to hear from you. Thank you, Richard. And Jun from Fullgoal, I just wanted to pose the same question to you as well. A simple question, really. So what are the reasons for investing in China now? Again, from our opening, aware that you've got a wonderful perspective on the market in terms of the small mid-cap market through the Fullgoal fund that you're managing hands-on. So really interested to hear your particular views on the market from that perspective as well.
My answer is more from a bottom-up perspective. You know that China equities has been massively underweighted by global funds in the past 3 years. But I think from a bottom-up perspective, the fundamentals of those stocks were really not that bad. I can see that a lot of Chinese companies, they have much strengthened their competitiveness in the past 3 years. Take the automobile industry as an example. Now we have 35% of market share from local domestic brands in China for this year, 2024. And there is only 4% 4 years ago in 2020. So that is a very huge progress. We also see that in other consumer discretionary industries, we see new Chinese brands emerging for sportswear, skincare, and also for jewelries. So I think they are no more low end and low margin. They are very well recognized by consumers in China. And also, as the world's second largest economy, China has a very comprehensive industrial chain, offering a vast area of investment opportunities, from manufacturing, service to internet and technology. And also, the valuation was really very low. The price-to-earnings ratio of MSCI China is only 11 price-to-earnings ratio. That is, I think the index is all about the best companies in the world. That is at a huge discount to global peers. That's why I hold a very positive view for China equity market.
Yeah, thank you. That looks very interesting, I think, and quite specific sectoral, detailed sectoral perspective there. So thank you so much for that. My next question I wanted to pose to you, Himalee, from Fidelity. I know that you've actually got quite an interesting portfolio of very different China funds. So I wanted to pose a slightly different question to you. You're welcome to make comment, of course, on that first question of why come in to invest in China now. But I'm particularly interested in the clients you work with, and that's the nature of your role, I think, dealing with clients and helping them build an exposure and allocation to China. Across the range of funds and for different client types, what are you recommending in the ways in which they can gain exposure to China? Very interested to hear the variety of approaches for different client needs and perspectives and positioning that you'd offer them.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for your question. And I would probably lean towards answering the question that you started this conversation with, which is, why is this a good time to be investing in China right now? So if you go back in time and if you look at, what are the best times to invest in markets? The best time to invest in markets for long-term returns are when they're completely out of favor and when everyone thinks that these markets are in for a structural collapse. So let's just take a second to remind ourselves that China is, as the panelists before me have said, China is the world's second largest economy. Its size at $18 trillion, which is a very large number. And such an economy is not going to disappear overnight, which is what the market has been fearing for the last 3 or 4 years, if one's candid about it. Now, an economy of this size, of course, will go from a stage of being a growth market to an ex-growth market, i.e., you're not going to see the 7 to 8% growth rates that you have seen in Chinese GDP in the last decade. They are not going to, follow through in this particular decade. But what's very interesting for us to observe, we have 18 analysts on the ground in China whose job day in and day out is to talk to companies, is to understand what's happening on the ground. And what we find is that there is no dearth of good businesses run by good management teams, trading at valuations that offer a very good, run for investors who are willing to stay in it for a long term. And the change that's happening in China is sort of being overshadowed by, the geopolitical conversation that's happened, by the regulatory risk we've seen in the last few years. So what you see is that China steadily is scaling up in terms of technology, in terms of innovation, but most importantly, it's being able to do it at a cost competitiveness that nobody else can match. Now, that is a very strong tailwind, structurally, if you look at the business. Why is this a very good time to invest in China? Because all of this development is being overlooked, because in the last 3 years, what's really been at the heart of every investor's interest is AI. And let's face it, the West, particularly the US, has dominated this conversation. So for us, we think that an unloved but steadily improving market, trading at a very attractive valuation point, offering a reasonable margin of safety for investors, is a very, very good entry point for us in China. So it would also be interesting for our esteemed audience to know that Fidelity is one of the few organizations that has a flagship product that runs to a value quality strategy. So what we are trying to do in this product is that we are trying to find businesses that are unloved, but have very strong structural franchises, have very strong underlying margins, but most importantly are managed by very good teams that are, seasoned in navigating uncertainty, the kind that we've seen over the last few years. Why is this our flagship strategy, and why do we at Fidelity believe that China is very suited for value investing? Well, one of the main reasons is that China is a very entrepreneurial mindset. If there is an industry which is seeing extremely high profit margins, it's seeing a very strong revenue growth, it tends to attract a lot of competition. Now, what happens when a lot of competition comes in, that it's great for the consumer of the industry, but the industry itself sees margins starting to shrink. Right? So you might be paying high valuations, expecting a high rate of growth, but what's happening underneath is that the margins are starting to shrink, and these valuations will not be sustainable over the long term. If you contrast that with a value approach, where you're looking for a boring X-growth business, but that business has a market size that's very hard, that becomes a competitive moat for itself. Like, for example, a business that's been running for 50 to 60 years, it has a 50 to 60% market share, and currently, because the industry is seen as X-growth, that business is available to you at 4 to 5 times, forward earnings, but offers you shareholder returns in forms of dividends and paybacks. I mean, you're buying so much margin of safety for yourself over the long term. And that is what our flagship strategy, the China Focus Fund, offers its investors. Now, if I was to cite a real life example of how we are finding opportunities, if you look at the real estate sector in China, which has been talked about nonstop for the last 3 or 4 years, everybody brushes off anything Chinese real estate. People brush it off and say there's absolutely no opportunity here. But if you dig down further, if you research further, what you find is that, yes, the real estate property developers are under stress, but China is a vertical country. You live in tall buildings, you live in, these building complexes, and these building complexes need to be managed. So you need a real estate management services company to come in and say, well, somebody needs to manage the lights, somebody needs to manage the landscaping, somebody needs to manage security. So this is what a value quality focused understanding gives us. It allows us to look deeper. It allows us to look beyond the obvious and find businesses that are still continuing to grow, are very attractively valued, and will create long-term, positive results for our investors.
Wonderful. Thank you, Himalee. Very interesting perspectives there on the value investing approach, and in combination with the perspective on the market that's looking for scale economies and that ability within the market for entrepreneurs to be very successful. And really, really interesting in particular about some gems within the real estate sector as it relates to management services. So really wonderful insights. Thank you for that. I'd like to go back to you, Richard, and I think shift the focus. We've talked about investing in China now, and I just wanted to extend that and get the thoughts of yourselves and the other panelists, really, in the time we've got remaining for this particular topic. Why invest into a China-focused fund? Of course, investors are thinking about what the long-term prospects are. So very interested, Richard, to hear your views on the long-term prospects of investing into the China market. What do you believe are the key drivers? What are the sort of themes that you're looking at for long-term investment within your portfolio? Richard, over to you.
Okay. So back to 20 years ago, when we invested in China, we can invest in commodity cycles because China is more focused on investment side, and commodity price increased by 2 or 3 times. But this time around, we will be more focused on the internet, e-commerce, technology, green economy, and going global for these trends. For instance, the internet, e-commerce in China, e-commerce penetration is almost highest one globally. Total e-commerce GMV is 50% higher than the US GMV. However, if you look at the internet companies, e-commerce companies combined together, Tencent, Alibaba, PDD, JD, all the market cap combined together, smaller than one single company, Amazon. But as we know, Alibaba, Tencent, PDD, and also TikTok, the total e-commerce GMV is much higher than Amazon. And as you can tell, the valuation of Chinese internet companies right now is only around 10 to 15 times PE ratio. And so I think the internet e-commerce will continue to drive the economy growth. Domestic consumption side, I think one of the best players is still invest in the internet and the e-commerce companies. So another trend is technology innovation. If you look at the GDP per capita, China is still a developing country. It's around $13,000 GDP per capita. However, if you look at the research, the R&D as a percentage of GDP, China spends 2.5% of the GDP on R&D, just in line with developed countries, and way above most of the developing countries, or even higher than some developed countries. And given the sheer size of China's economy, I think the total research and development expenditure in China is significant. And given the low cost, a relatively low cost of Chinese engineers and scientists, so I think the impact on the research and the development on the whole economy will be significant. So that's the reason we really believe technology innovation is driving the economy growth, and the opportunities is everywhere, not only in the IT sector, but also in the industrial and also even in material. The opportunities is across different sectors and industries in terms of technology innovation. Also, renewable energy is also a big trend. As you can tell, in the last 5 years, Chinese government has very strong commitment to go green, and 2060, for instance, in 2030, China will become carbon neutrality. That's a very strong, very serious commitment, and Chinese companies are also working on that. For instance, China accounts for more than 85% of global solar panel production, the entire value chain. In the last 15 years, the solar panel price went down by more than 93%, mainly driven by Chinese companies. And right now, the solar panel become economically viable in the most parts of the world. It's mainly because Chinese companies can produce high quality panel solar and at very low cost. Also, electric vehicle in China right now account for around 60% of global EV. I think this number is around 55 to 60% of global EV shipment. Also in the battery space, Chinese battery producers account for 60% of total global battery shipments. So in the green economy, I think Chinese companies continue to develop high quality products at affordable price, mainly driven by technology, by innovation, and also economy of scale. The last trend or the last opportunity I want to mention is going global. Think about 20 years ago, when Chinese companies going global, is manufacture in China, sell to global. It's basically it's the labor, employment, supply chains all in China. But right now, this time around of going global is not only manufactured global, actually it's manufactured globally, basically hire globally, and the supply chain to source the suppliers globally, and to do research globally, and to sell products globally. It's more like a global citizen instead of mainly focus on China. So I think this globalization will continue even although the globalization has some headwind, we know in the short term, but over the long term, we think this kind of globalization will continue because the value will not only add in China, but also add in the local market. adding the local market to create job opportunities locally, and more. And also the suppliers will more come from local suppliers, and also the products sell in the locally, and the investors become global. So this time around, I think this globalization will continue right now. For instance, CATL or TikTok, they've also DJI, they become more global, and we expect more and more Chinese companies can become more globalization going forward. That's a big trend, and we believe this trend will last for at least 1 or 2 decades. Although we have some headwind of globalization, but we still believe Chinese companies going global cannot be stopped.
Wonderful, thank you, Richard. Some really good themes there, a great distillation of themes based on your perspective of the market of long-term drivers of growth within the market, clearly linked in terms of entrepreneurialism and technology and innovation and R&D. So thank you for that. Jun, I just wanted to pose a similar question to yourself. Clearly, again, you're constructing your portfolio with a view to what's going to drive medium to longer term growth. And again, I think you've probably got some really interesting perspectives on, from a sectoral perspective, in relation to, for example, rising competitiveness of the Chinese companies across the different sectors that you're covering. So very interested to hear from you as well on that topic, Jun.
Yeah, actually, I can see a lot of opportunities across a lot of sectors, like internet. Although the penetration rate is high in domestically, they can also go overseas to expand their market share. And also, I see consumer brands, they are rising and gaining market share, and also result in a higher margin. And I want to elaborate this issue from a more top-down side. That I know that I understand people talking about China's problem, like over-investment in infrastructure, and also the population is more aging than the India. But from my side, I think a lot of people just ignored the fact that in China, there is a large gap between the rural area and the urban area. The living standards in countryside is not quite high as that in the cities. So I think when the living standards of the rural area has catch up with the cities, there will be a lot of growth potential for demand. Not only for physical goods, but also for services. I think that is that will provide a lot of growth opportunities for China as a whole economy. And also,
Go ahead, Jun, sorry.
And also, I see many companies invest heavily in research and development that will benefit their margins in the long term. So I think as the world's second largest economy, China is still very young and has a lot of room to grow.
Wonderful, thank you, Jin. A really interesting perspective again. Again, addressing some of those problems that you identified on overinvestment in infrastructure, arguably the ageing population burden, and this view that there's a lot still to go in terms of the impact of rising wealth across the broader market, both rural and urban, which is going to drive the demand in goods and services. So Himalee, I think the last question to you, again, you can take a long-term perspective. If there's an opportunity within that to have a look at risks, very interested to hear this sort of value-based investing perspective you've got on the market and the opportunity to think about where there's, I suppose, hidden gems, if you like, and you talked about that before, that the real estate management services market. Really interested to get that sort of top-down, broader perspective on the long-term growth drivers and your thoughts on that within what you do at Fidelity.
Thank you, Dan. So if I was to talk about risk and return, I think the risk and return conundrum is an investment conundrum, right? It doesn't matter what you're investing in, what asset class you're looking at. That is an investor's job, is to look at the risk and return equation and see how that balances. Now, what's happened to China, particularly in the last few years, is that the risk has been exaggerated so much that it has subdued a pragmatic assessment of returns. So all that we talk in the context of China is risk, 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 and we forget that it's an investor's market. If you have a disciplined approach, there are opportunities to be found and exercised. So let's just talk a little bit about risk in China. So what has been the two most obvious risks in China in the last 2 years? The first one has been obviously geopolitics, particularly the dissonance that you see with the US. And we all here in the room and in the audience perhaps know that this dissonance is not going anywhere, because it is not about one particular president or another particular president. It's about how competitive China is becoming and how that is an issue for the West to take care of. So the Sino-US relationships are going to remain challenging for a while. And given you've spoken about President Trump at the beginning of your conversation, so given that we have a new president coming in, new president, but will they resort to old means? It's to be seen. But the conversation that's been regularly doing the rounds is, will President Trump impose a very high level of tariff on China? Now, for us, it's not clear yet whether this is going to be imposed either as policy or be presented on the table as a negotiation tactic to drive a better set of deals for the US. I mean, that remains to be seen. And I think it's also important to mention, really, really important to mention, that among all its global trade partners that the US has, the Chinese have been imposed to the highest degree of tariff in the last 5 to 6 years, if not longer. And that is a really, really important point, because that gives the Chinese a sense of experience with tariffs. They've also been able to manage their costs to address these tariff issues. And they've also been able to manage their production bases to address this tariff issue. So this tariff-led uncertainty actually is higher for the other US trading partners than it is for China, only in terms of familiarity. I think that's a really important point for us to bring to this forum. The other point of risk is a regulatory risk. And what we've seen in the last 7 to 8 weeks is a very clear indication that the regulatory direction from China is going to be supportive and pro-growth. So that's a risk that sort of is turning on its head and becoming an opportunity for you to find the right beneficiaries of that opportunity. What's also, again, our research, our experience tells us that you have to understand the regulatory risk. For example, when we talk about anti-corruption in China, it's not always a risk to business. It could also be a path to growth. So if you talk about what Chinese are doing, for example, in the hospital space, where they want drug disbursement to be more and more disconnected from hospitals to avoid corruption, it also means that there's going to be a tailwind for businesses such as pharmacy chains to grow, because they are the ones who will be receiving the drug distribution chain and take closer to an aging population. So that understanding of how risk can actually be a source of return is really, really important. The third element of risk is actually consistent, again, across all assets, across all stock markets, which is to understand individual thesis that you're buying at the end of the day. There is market momentum that can drive you and can bring short-term tactical returns. But if you are a long duration investor, if you are looking for long-term value generation out of a market like China, it's really, really important that you have the resources at hand, you have the research at hand to be able to look at every individual investment thesis, look at the fundamentals that surround it, and understand where the stock-specific risk will come from, and then take a measured risk-return assessment and pay a particular valuation for it. And then use that knowledge to construct a portfolio that can sort of withstand the uncertainties of economic cycles that every single market in the world will go through. I think I'd like to close my comments by saying that the greatest risk around China is the risk of not investing in China and missing out on a very solid long-term opportunity. Because let's remind ourselves, we are still talking about an $18 trillion economy, the second largest in the world, very similar in size to what all of EU aggregates to. And the policy responses are signaling a very pro-growth message to all of us. We understand that there is going to be dissonance with the US, but as my esteemed panelists have said, China is internationalizing. There are other markets to consider. There is an abundance of highly skilled human resources. There's an abundance of innovation. And at this point in time, from where we sit, it's a highly unloved market with all ingredients for long-term returns.
Excellent. Thank you, Himalee. A very well considered and disciplined approach to assessing the market and the opportunities with some really detailed and specific examples on an industry basis. So wonderful response. Thank you for that. Look, just in closing, I'm aware of time, but thank you to all the panelists. A really wonderful discussion from my perspective, covering that topic of why invest into a China fund now. I think we've actually brought up a very broad range of issues and topics that reflect, I think, the different perspectives of you as different, quite distinct asset managers and the focus you've got within your funds. Some really interesting information to prospective investors to digest there, and a wonderful closing point, I think, too, Himalee. One of the risks is the risk of not investing and getting exposure to China. So clearly, I think there's a view there that this is a very significant opportunity, and I think we've put together a really insightful case to give investors a degree of confidence to move forward to invest in and gain exposure into the China market. So thank you very much again to all panelists for your time today. Very much enjoyed the discussion with you also. Thank you. And back to you, Judith.
Thank you, Dan. And likewise, I truly enjoyed listening to our expert panel on making the case for buying a China-focused fund. And what do you need to do so? You need access channels. And this is what we're going to talk about next, with a deep dive into the latest innovations in China's capital markets. And as guest speaker, I have the pleasure to introduce you to Jeffrey Guo, Managing Director at Guotai Junan Securities. In this role, Jeffrey looks at the firm's international clients. Before joining Guotai Junan Securities, Jeffrey Guo was with HSBC in London. He led the World Bank's debut bond issuances in China. He's also a member of the Standing Committee of the Youth Federation of the People's Bank of China. And Jeffrey also writes about Chinese bond markets and about China finance. And he translated the book Bonds Without Borders, published in 2014 by Chris O'Malley, and then in China in 2015 with Jeffrey's translation. So great to have you with us as an expert on the latest innovations in China's capital markets. I look forward to learning more about them. Over to you, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Judith, for the kind words, and welcome everyone to the China Finance Forum. I want to extend my heartfelt thanks for the Luxembourg for Finance for hosting this event. China's capital market have transformed dramatically from being relatively closed to being one of the largest and most dynamic markets in the world, and attracting investors from every corner of the globe. This evolution is nothing short of remarkable. In fact, over the last year alone, foreign ownership in China's stock market has surged to approximately 5% of the total market capitalization, a clear sign of the increasing confidence international investors have in China's market. At the heart of this transformation is a commitment to openness. Products such as panda bonds and GDRs are breaking down barriers and investing a diverse range of international issuers and investors to participate. Recent initiatives have also streamlined access for foreign capital, further enhancing the investment landscape in China. Today, we're here to explore these advancements further. We'll discuss new updates to investment channels for international investors, including panda bonds, yuan bonds, GDR, and QFI, among others. As we navigate this landscape of innovation and growth, we'll invite you to consider the opportunities that China market present. So let's dive into these exciting developments shaping the future of investing in China. Panda bond. The dynamic zeal of China's bond market boasts an astonishing size exceeding 160 trillion yuan. Within this vast landscape, Panda bonds, despite their relatively modest share, have drawn significant market attention recently. The surge in interest is attributable to notable increase in issuance since 2023 and the increasing diverse range of issuers. As a niche financial instrument in China, the issuance of Panda bond has reached 159 billion yuan and is expected to surpass 200 billion yuan in 2024, marking a record high for the second consecutive year and showcasing a remarkable year-on-year growth of 31.71%. The array of issuers is equally impressive, including Asian Development Bank, the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, as well as renowned international corporations, including those in Europe, such as Mercedes-Benz and BASF. This highlights the increasing openness of China's bond market and a sustained effort to lower financing costs in the domestic market. With supportive government policies, the Panda bond market is poised to become a crucial financing avenue for non-Chinese entities. At the end of 2022, the People's Bank of China and the State Administration of Foreign Exchange jointly issued policies allowing issuers to transfer funds raised domestically to overseas destinations or return them for domestic use, significantly broadening the use of funds raised through Panda bonds. In 2023, the National Association of Financial Market Institutional Investors, NAFMI, also introduced a series of optimization measures, including lifting the restrictions on the number of lead underwriters for registration issuance and deepening the pilot program for listing overseas exchanges. These measures have further enhanced the appeal and convenience of the Panda bond market. On the other hand, the Federal Reserve's interest rate cuts is expected to create room for further monetary easing in China. We have already seen rate cuts again in the second half from PBOC. This means that the wider interest rates differential between China and the US will continue to attract Panda bond issuers and ongoing increase in foreign investors' instruments in China's bond market. And Panda bonds will enhance the liquidity of, certainly will enhance the liquidity, further driving the expansion of the market. All these factors suggest a robust future for Panda bond market, providing global investors with more diversified instruments options and further strengthen the influence of the RMB in the international financial markets. Next, I'll introduce Yulan bond and Minzu bond. Shifting our focus to offshore bonds, we'll see exciting developments with instruments such as Minzu bond and Yulan bond. Minzu bond and Yulan bond has scaled in size as well. Minzu bond, the free trade zone bonds introduced in 2022, has had more than 80 issuance, exceeding a scale of 100 billion yuan. Yulan bond, since Guotai Junan issued the bond as the first to do so in the securities industry in 2021, has also reached a new milestone. On October 16, the 100 million euro Yulan bond issued by Oriental Securities Company was listed in Luxembourg Stock Exchange, marking the exchange the first in Europe to list and admit this unique asset class to trading. This has made possible through a tripartite collaboration between Luxembourg Exchange, Shanghai Clearinghouse, and Euroclearbank together with the issuer, which gives international investors a new opportunity to trade the Chinese bond on Luxembourg Exchange market, with trade settlement to take place in Euroclearbank's environment, offering international investors a new investment into China. Next, I'll introduce Bond Connect and Swap Connect and Repo. The Bond Connect accounted for 2/3 of foreign investors' total turnover in China's onshore interbank bond market in 2023. Meanwhile, we're making good progress in helping bond holders to better manage their risks and liquidity. Launched last year, the Swap Connect complements the Bond Connect by facilitating global investors' management of interest rate risks arising from their allocation to mainland China bonds. As of the end of April 2024, 20 domestic quotation providers and 58 foreign investors had entered into the market more than 3,600 interest rate swaps transactions with an aggregate notional value of approximately 1.77 trillion RMB and daily notional value of 7.6 billion RMB. The daily notional value within calendar months has also increased from RMB 3 billion of the launch months to more than 12 billion in April 2024. In January this year, the HKMA and the People's Bank of China also jointly announced further opening up of the onshore repo market to all foreign institutional investors that already have the access to onshore bond market, including Bond Connect investors. These new measures will facilitate international investors' diverse use of their mainland bond holdings and provide them with more liquidity management tools, thereby enhancing the depth and breadth of their participation in the mainland bond market. Not only the bond market is seeing encouraging developments that reaffirm the authorities' continued support for mainland issuers to tap the international market for cross-financing, the equity market, including QFII and the Stock Connect scheme and GDR, has also evolved significantly, transforming from a closed system into one of the world's largest and most accessible market for investors. The QFII program, once a tightly capped initiative, has been evolving rapidly. Since the consolidation of the QFII and RQFII back in 2020, a series of new rules were released to streamline the process, including the removal of investment quota limitation and expansion of investment scope to include listed commodity futures, commodity options, stock index options, and ETFs, adding diversity into the investor portfolios. The results have been remarkable, with the inflows picking up significantly. In 2021 alone, 119 institutional investors applied to join the program, leading the total of 854 existing institutional investors now participating. Complementing this, the Stock Connect program offers another major pathway for foreign capital to access China's capital market without needing special quotas or complex approvals. The program has also undergone similar updates, including investment scope expansion and lifting of quota limits. Compared with Connect program, the QFII offer a wider range of investment targets, and therefore is certainly highly recommended for international investors. The GDRs market has gained significant momentum as the country aims to bolster its international presence and attract foreign investment. Following the initial launch of GDRs in London, recent years have witnessed a substantial expansion of the program, now extending the markets to Switzerland and Germany, thereby providing Chinese companies with enhanced access to European capital. While the new regulatory framework tightened the issuance standard, it has not deterred companies from leveraging GDRs as a vital tool. Instead, we have witnessed an encouraging trend, particularly among firms that in photovoltaic and energy storage sectors, indicating a strong preference for GDRs as a viable means of capital raising. As global investors increasingly seek exposure to China's green transition, the GDR framework provides a robust mechanism for them to invest in innovative Chinese companies that are leading the charge in clean energy. Overall, the ongoing development of China's GDR reflects a dynamic interplay of regulatory evolution and market demand, paving the way for enhanced cross-border investment opportunities and positioning Chinese firms favorably within the global financial landscape. As we conclude our exploration of the development in China's capital markets, it is evident that innovation is driving significant change and opening up new avenues for growth. The commitment to enhancing market accessibility and fostering global integration reflects a dynamic landscape ripe with opportunities. So let us continue to observe how these trends unfold in the coming years. Judith, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey Gore, there, giving us some food for thought and a true insight into the evolution of China's capital markets. And this takes us neatly to our next topic. And I want to set this up with a reminder of something that we keep coming back to at the China Finance Forum, and that is the extraordinary potential of the vast pool of savings held by China's 1.4 billion citizens, thanks to a savings rate of 45% of GDP. And to put this into a global perspective, according to IMF data, as of 2023, China generated some 28% of global savings. That's just behind the 33% of the US and the European Union combined. And a 2023 report by PwC speaks therefore of a, and I quote, golden age of China's wealth management, and highlights China's growing number of affluent and financially sophisticated citizens whose rising demand for overseas assets is channeled through programs such as QDII and QDLP. And these programs, as we know, are capped by quotas, which can be lifted by SAFE, China's foreign currency regulator, as was the case with QDII in June this year. And meanwhile, a report by the Rhodium Group shows that after a few years of slowdown due to policy changes and the impact of the pandemic, Chinese companies are again expanding abroad since 2022. But the report goes on to say that there seems to be, and I quote, a new generation of ODIs, outbound direct investments, with different objectives and destinations compared to those previous decades. And our second panel will now talk more in detail about these latest developments in Chinese outbound investments. And as moderator for the discussion, I have the pleasure to welcome back a familiar face for this audience, Chen, who previously joined us on the China Finance Forum 2021, and she's joining us now from Hong Kong. Charlotte is a partner at Elvinger Prussen, and she has been with the firm for more than 10 years and is indeed in charge of their Hong Kong office. So, warm welcome back, Charlotte. Great to have you with us once again, and I hand it over to you and your panel.
Thanks, Judith. Good afternoon to Asia and good morning to Europe. Glad to be here with my panelists to discuss this most interesting topic. Together with me, I have Natasha Xie, partner of law firm JunHe based in Shanghai, specialized in fund formation and fund-related matters and working with highly regarded foreign financial institutionals and institutional investors around the globe. Together with us, Jeff Lee, Chief Investment Officer of eFunds Management, and also serves as the head of the Global Equity Department. Welcome to both. Our topic today is focusing on China's outbound investment. And before we start, perhaps a bit of background in addition to the introduction made by Judith earlier. China's outbound investment has emerged as a significant force in the global economy for the past 2 decades. In 2023, China's outbound direct investment grew significantly, making its position as the world's 3rd largest global investor. Chinese companies are looking to seek growth beyond their borders, and they have invested in various sectors, including technology, energy, and infrastructures. These trends reflect China's strategic objective to secure resources, expand market access, and also enhance its global influence. And this expansion is not without challenge. Geopolitical tensions, regulatory barriers, and shifting economy landscape pose risk to Chinese investors. A key aspect of China's outbound investment landscape, as Judith also mentioned earlier, is the control of the capital flow. Restrictions have been put in place to limit the ability of individuals, but also business, to move money out of the country. Therefore, it is by far the most important question for Chinese investors to find a stable but reliable channel for transferring monies outside China. So, Natasha, for you, you must have dealt a lot with these questions since you practice as a lawyer. I know various channels are available, QDII, QDLP, ODI, but what are really these channels, these quotas, and how can we obtain them? And also, what would be the available or the suitable channel for investors depending on their target investment?
Charlotte, thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about this very interesting question. Yes, we did talk about this outbound investment for many years, and we know that there already been a long history for the development of QDII regime. This is a permanent regime. There are multiple type of financial institutions that they would be able to get the qualification and also quotas to offering products to Chinese either individual investors or corporate investors, so different types of investors. So I can start with the QDII because this is a mature legal system. And as you can see, many local financial institutions or Sino-foreign joint ventures or even wholly foreign-owned financial institutions have already got this qualification and quotas. The problem is always about the quota because, in China, we do have the capital control, and sometimes it really depends on the whole environment. So it's not predictable sometimes because although we still believe that this regime will continue, and we believe the authority, the SAFE, would continue to grant more quota, but sometimes people have to wait. So the business development would be restricted because of this quota control. But it's a China policy. I mean, people have to adapt to this situation. And I'm confident at this moment because as a permanent scheme that is still evolving, because I have seen new institutions have already been granted new quotas this year. And I am happy to see that, for example, bank wealth management institutions, they were also approved new quota and qualification. That's good. That is a good sign for the industry. And second is safe, although, because the current economy situation, it probably would be too sensitive to mention this topic. But in reality, in the business world, you can see that there's still strong demands for the outflow of money, particularly from the Chinese high net worth individuals. So that is, that can explain the situation that many private banks or other wealth management institutions, they're still very busy in helping Chinese investors to do this global assets allocation. That's a very important job. Although maybe you cannot read more information from the public domain, but this is still very active business. As you said, that we are dealing with this every day. So now let's talk about multiple channels. QDII is a mature channel. We also have some, we can say, pilot scheme. That is, for example, QDLP or other more innovative regime. For example, the total return swap, which actually is a type of depository products, structured depository products linked to overseas fund. These are all new. Although QDLP also has a relatively long history, but it is still a pilot. So actually, the local government, when they promote this regime, they would have some discretionary power to determine who are qualified and what conditions should be satisfied. And in my view, as a supplement to the QDII, which is a permanent scheme, the QDLP scheme also has, more interest from the foreign community. Number one is you can see that from the public domain, there already been information released that this regime has already attracted many global asset managers to set up an office in China and set up a feeder fund in order to invest in overseas fund. Again, it is also subject to the quota limitation, but the good news is it is still continue. So although the frequency of approval may not be like sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's faster, but it's still moving on. So that's good. And hopefully, like after a little bit slow down in the past few months, we will see another round of new quota issuing. And again, the good news is it's not only for the existing QDLP managers approved, but also for new ones. So you will see a more diversified managers interested in this business. And also, as I mentioned about some innovation, for example, the cross-border TRS or, structured products linked to overseas fund. I think that's also something worthwhile to explore. But again, for different types of managers, they need to know that, it's always like they need to go deeper. They need to know more about this regime. They don't need to know devil in details. They need to know more details about this regime. Thank you.
But Natasha, you mentioned that so the QDII regime is really a fixed regime, which has been used for years, and QDLP is relatively new. But would you think that the QDLP would also become a permanent regime, just like QDII?
Although the QDLP is still a pilot scheme and mainly sponsored by the local government, but in my view, I think eventually people would still possibly turn it to a permanent one, because number one, it depends on whether the authority would issue more approval. Number two is whether market participants would continue to show strong interest. And I have seen these two directions have good developments. But the only issue is about a universally applicable rule, which may not be, mature to come out. So maybe we still see the name of pilot, but in a long-term view, it would have the potential to grow to be a permanent one.
Thanks, Natasha. Very interesting. So once the money is out, either through the QDI or QDLP, they will need to be invested because they have gone through all those hassles. So they need the money to be invested in a good way. So the effort would not be lost. So Jeff, you are running onshore and Luxembourg-based investment funds who invest globally on behalf of Chinese investors. How are they diversifying these days their portfolio internationally, and what region are they really targeting?
Right.
Sorry.
Thanks. Right, sure. Thanks. Thanks for having me. Sure. In terms of the target region for investment, I would say US is by far the top destination for Chinese investors, partially because many of the US companies are already pretty well known in China, partially because the risk-return profile for the US market is just quite outstanding among the major markets in recent years, which is very noticeable in China as well. The innovation sector for the US market, for example, technology, healthcare, they are particularly popular. If we move on to the rest of the world, Europe, to the less extent, Europe also attracts quite a lot of Chinese investment, both in the public market, but also in private markets. I'm sure so the audience in the European market can notice this. And this, their sector focuses. For example, Chinese investors quite like the luxury goods sector, the European healthcare. Europe is quite a leader in green technology as well. And of course, the old school manufacturing sector, which European companies also are global leaders. Probably some of our friends can notice that private debt market in Europe has been quite attractive in recent years for Chinese investors as well. Then these are the top destinations. And then if we move back to Asia, economies like Vietnam, Indonesia, India, they are also gaining attention, partially because these economies are just growing very fast, similar to China, or even faster than China, because they have favorable demographics and quite good digital adoption in early phases, and also partially because it's quite easy for Chinese investors to relate the investment case, to make sense of the investment case. You can hear people saying, "Oh, this country is like China 30 years ago, 20 years ago," and they will just follow the textbook of China and draw their investment plan. It works quite well. And lastly, I want to highlight Japan. Japan has been very popular in terms of as an investment destination for Chinese investors in the last couple of years. Also because it's close to China from both geographic perspective, but also in many ways culturally, there are a lot of similarities, and even the languages. Some of the written Japanese can be read by Chinese as well, and also a lot of Japanese companies are very well known in China. So, and in addition, a very strong market, as we can notice over the last 2 years, attracts a lot of attention. So if we go down go all around the world, roll out the map and go all around the world, these are the top destinations that, as fund managers, I can see where my investors keep asking questions about.
Thanks, Jeff. So I can see that North America, led by the US, is still by far the most favorable destination by Chinese investors. So given the recent US elections, how would you, Jeff, as an asset manager, take into account the geopolitical risk that we have faced for decades, for several years at least, and will continue to face when you will be deciding where and how to invest and to be, so that's the interest of the client, but also at the fund will be well served?
Right. Okay. I'll speak from general terms because, as you rightly pointed out, in recent years there are definitely more focuses on geopolitical risks. For the most part of my career, it's not geopolitical risk is not very high up on the list of considerations for asset managers because there were no meaningful paradigm shift for as long as a few decades. Now we are essentially in a changing world order. We're moving from a world that's prioritizing efficiency to one that's focusing on national security and a lot of the local agenda, and that's changing a lot of the rules for conducting businesses for corporates. In my opinion, it's I'm a fund manager. For me, the number one way to deal with any risk, especially geopolitical risk, is to diversification. I'm a firm believer of the benefit of global diversification. In the past, we have seen strategies that focusing on just one region, one sector, or one theme, or one style, they will not work as well going forward as they did before. And in order to do diversification well, the key thing to do is to have a systematic analytical framework for the world, your mental model of the world. The model should include all regions and sectors, all asset classes, and also the mechanisms on how each part of what I just said interact with the rest. And then it goes without saying that, to do this well, you need a lot of expertise, experiences, and insights. But once the model is built, the benefit is enormous. You can allocate capital to build a internationally diversified portfolio, and you can avoid sectors and companies and even a region that could obviously be at risk when judging by the way we think is going to happen. Then what we can do is to follow the developments closely and regularly rebalance the portfolio accordingly. We are seeing investors are doing this already. Over the last few years, we noticed that Chinese investors are diversifying into markets like what I said, Japan, India, Saudi Arabia in their portfolio when it's possible. And we could also see investor hedging to some extent the geopolitical risks by allocating to asset classes like gold, Bitcoin, et cetera. So to your specific point, in terms of going forward, U.S.-China relationship, it's hard to see. It's yet to see what's actually going to happen, but the principle I just laid out should be very relevant.
So the key word is diversification for investors. Yeah, that totally makes sense. I think as a lawyer, we also give similar advice, or only from a legal perspective to our clients. And now to Natasha, from the lawyer's perspective, this geopolitical concern must have also occupied your team for a while. So what would be the concern that you have seen of asset managers from that perspective? And is there any also medication that you could find for them?
I think this is a technical issue and really need a lot of, help from your legal advisor, particularly given this is still evolving. For example, at the end of September, China also announced 3 companies which are included in the section list, which are all US companies. And I think this is also something like immediately the managers need to seek legal advice from the PRC Council. Definitely, this would increase the cost because for these compliance issues, they may come out from time to time. They need to think about it and see how to comply with both the Chinese regulation and the US regulation. So it's not only for inbound business, but also for the outbound business. And particularly for the outbound business, Chinese investors, if they were sectioned by MOFCOMs and fall into the scope of anti-foreign section law, then no Chinese entity can deal with these sectioned entities. So that's again, they need to put a number of measures to avoid this happen. And in case that when investors or account parties have already been onboarded, then we need to think about how to exit from that investment. So that will be a number of actions that taken by the managers. But so far we have seen, I think for the subsidiary of U.S. companies in China or purely U.S. managers, they already seek advice and find a practical solution. And it covers both the onboarding process and if it is an existing investor, how to deal with this. We can come out is with a practical solution to our clients in order to manage the risks.
Well, that's a lot of follow from the inside, but also from the outside on a permanent basis. But
exactly.
Geopolitical is definitely a key element, I guess, for Chinese investors, perhaps also for foreign investors, to consider before investing. But according to the data released by Financial Times, there has been a boost in renewable energy investment, with $110 billion USD committed in 130 projects since early 2023. So apart from the geopolitical elements, I would assume that the ESG, the environment, social governance, is also a key element that Chinese investors are taking into consideration. Jeff, to you again, do you also see that in Chinese investors' request behavior?
Absolutely. Actually, my firm is a pioneer and leader in this space, ESG investing in China. So I probably can share a bit of a color on this. What I can say is that in China, ESG investing is quickly becoming mainstream. There are several drivers behind this. The most important driver is, as you can imagine, coming from top-down central policy making. It starts with our commitment to 2030 carbon peak, 2060 carbon neutrality. But we also recently talk about high-quality growth policy, which further accelerate this trend. And then, secondly, the regulators in China, financial regulators in China, are actively promoting high-quality ESG as a mandate. For example, there are a lot of new requirements of sustainability disclosure and also requirement for better shareholder returns among Chinese listed companies. Then the listed companies are actively engaged as well. According to our data, there are about 40% of Chinese companies now, in some form, disclose ESG report. They have a dedicated ESG report, 40% of them. And more companies, we can clearly see this in domestic market. They're raising dividend and payout ratios and increasing buyback activities. Then the next element is that the investment community, like ourselves, are also quickly getting on board. Our clients, which are the asset owners, they start to incorporate ESG considerations in their decision making. We can see the number of ESG related mandate are increasing quite a lot in the last few years. And also we asset management firms responded by launching a lot of ESG related investment products. So the ESG related AUM are actually growing quite fast, although the Chinese market haven't been has been quite volatile over the last few years. And then lastly, the retail investors. Which is massive, as as Judith at the beginning said, there's a lot of savings in China, and that's there to be allocated. So the retail investors are important. We need to get them on board. What I can say is that retail investors are paying more attention to ESG, but we're still in early phases, especially when it comes to what we talk about today, outbound ESG diversification. They're interested and they see the potential, but they probably need more information, a bit more time, slightly better data to be really convinced and embrace fully. But we are hopeful because as ESG reporting improves, investors get more educated about ESG products both domestically and overseas. We're likely to see quite a bigger shift towards ESG investing in their portfolio allocations.
Yeah, I'm sure the retail will perhaps follow the institutional investors' trends at some point, as they have always done in the past for other factors to be taken into considerations. So ESG is definitely something we all need to follow closely for the future. Something else that we should perhaps bear in mind is also this increasing regulated investment environments. I'm thinking about countries around the world who are putting in place foreign investment screening mechanism, just as the one that Europe has done in the past and Luxembourg implemented, preventing foreign investors to invest into sensitive sectors. So to you, Natasha, as a lawyer, how do regulatory changes in China would influence the investment decision of Chinese investors moving forward?
I think number one, China is still trying to open up its capital market to the world, and will continue trying to attract more foreign capital inflow. So in terms of the inbound investment, I would say that maybe the most uncertain part would be the industry policy. So for example, for certain industry, whether there will be nationwide policy that could have huge implication on the industry or the investors of the industry. So for example, in the past few years, people are very much concerned about the policies for certain industries, and that's again, for now, I think the situation has already been improved because China would be continue to show commitment for open up this market. This is number one. Number two, they also promise to improve transparency and to give more time for the communication between the authorities when they propose a new regulation or new law. So I think this would be more technical issues on how the market would deliver the message to the regulator and how the regulator want to send the message to the market. Particularly given the September 24th, a series of stimulus policy, you can see that actually right now China has been affirmative on a number of points. Number one is still about the opening up. Number two, about the stability of the financial market. And number three is about continue to support long-term capital to invest in China. So I think potentially it will be good for those, we call it long-term capital to stay in China, to operate and to do a good business in China. So again, in China, everybody still believe that policy uncertainty is a huge problem. But I think situation is still improving, and hopefully, we can see more transparency in the next few years.
Thanks, Natasha. I think that is very encouraging news for all of us here on this panel. I think we are perhaps running out of time. Maybe one last question as the bonus question to both of you. What are the main challenges and opportunities that Chinese investors face in today's investment landscape, both within China and internationally? Who want to start?
Maybe I'll start. Very briefly, in terms of challenges, domestically, it's basically the domestic economy is moving to the next phases of high quality growth. So the asset return domestically are not going to be as high as they used to be. That's the major challenge for all investors in onshore. In terms of overseas market, we touched on this earlier. The major challenge is that there's still not a lot of market access and products available. So the demand is there, but there's not enough supply. I just want to add to, I just came across that just in addition to what Natasha mentioned at the beginning of the the first question, in terms of the ways to access overseas market, there are cross-border. I want to add one more, which is cross-border wealth management connect program, which is applicable to residency in Greater Bay Area, and this allows people to buy products in Hong Kong and Macau. And that's also a quota-based system, but that's relevant. It's going to probably become quite substantial going forward. So just to add on to that, but in general, not enough supply of products. In terms of opportunity, though, there's, from my perspective, the overseas market for Chinese investors to touch on is the opportunity is still massive. We're still early in the journey, so the potential is certainly there. Then domestically. If you look at domestic market in terms of opportunity, I would also highlight that although we are moving into a slower growth phase, but you will see more Chinese companies focus more on profitability and shareholder return, and this could make the market into drive the market into the next up phase, sustainable growth. So which is quite promising. And then, and lastly, opportunity in terms of opportunity-wise, I would also want to highlight a high-yield asset in Hong Kong, because there's a Hong Kong Connect program where Chinese investors can buy with no limitation into Hong Kong market, and what Hong Kong market can offer are high-yielding stocks. They are stable cash flow. For onshore products who struggle to have enough return domestically, and this is a great asset to have for their portfolio. I'll stop there.
I think I can talk about from the investor and the manager perspective, because for the investor perspective, there are two things. One is about the quota supply, because anyway, it's subject to the authority's discretion. And number two is about the supply of more products. Just as Jeff said, it's more like diversification and supply of different types of products. This is for the investor side. While for the manager side, I think the key challenge or the problem is to find the right localized team and local distribution partner. It's very important to be success, on this point.
Thanks, Natasha, and thanks to Jeff. Thanks to both of you. As we wrap up our discussion on China's outbound investment, it is clear that this topic encompasses a complex interplay of opportunities and challenges. As we move forward, the importance of sustainability, but also regulatory consideration cannot be overstated. They will perhaps increasingly shape how Chinese firms approach the global market. I would like to thank my distinguished panelists, Natasha and Jeff, for your valuable sharing and insights on this very much interesting topic. We hope today's discussion shed light on the complexity, but also opportunity that arise in this ever-changing global investment landscape. Thank you to all. Now back to you, Judith, to the studio.
Thank you so much, Charlotte Chen there, and her terrific panel speakers, giving us truly lots of food for thought about Chinese outbound investment. And we're going to stay with this outbound perspective and tie the next conversation back to a topic we covered repeatedly at the China Finance Forum, and that is Chinese e-commerce, which is closely interrelated with the evolution of cross-border digital payments. And our next guest speaker will share with us the latest on the developments in this area. He represents one of China's leading fintechs in this field of cross-border digital payments. And the conversation will be led by Luxembourg for Finance's very own head of business development, Chris Hollifield. Now, in this role, Chris advises fintechs and financial companies looking to develop cross-border activity through Luxembourg-based platforms. He also advises on the development of the ecosystem in Luxembourg and on synergy creation with other key financial centers around the world, with a focus on East Asia. And I happen to know he speaks excellent Mandarin. Now, prior to joining LFF in 2018, Chris served at Clearstream Banking with a focus on strategic digital ledger technology and other fintech projects. So, warm welcome to you, Chris. Good to have you with us. And I hand it over to you and your guest.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Judith. And I'm now delighted to be joined by David Messenger, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Global Businesses for PingPong, which is a leading global provider of embedded finance solutions for financial institutions, fintechs, corporates, and many others. David has over 2 decades of senior management experience in tech-focused companies across the world, in the Americas, in Europe, in the Middle East, and of course in Asia. And so it's great to have you today with us to talk about payments, David.
Hi, Chris. No, very happy to join you.
So maybe just to kick off, as I've said, you have extremely long experience in the payment sector and have worked for firms that have been headquartered both in the US and Europe, but also in China. And so I think you're kind of uniquely positioned to provide some sectoral insights into developments in payments in both countries across borders. What would you point as being some key unifying factors when it comes to working in payments across these kind of regions?
Thanks, Chris. So I think there are probably 2 key dimensions to look at. One is, what are the market forces driving growth and evolution in the industry? And the second are the regulatory forces, which are shaping how that evolution happens and setting the guardrails around the innovation and new solutions coming to market. I think on the market side, there are certain universal truths, whether you're operating in Asia or in Western markets, and those are primarily around, first and foremost, reliability. Secondly, speed and transparency. And I think those 2 are actually very much linked. And thirdly, it's around speed, efficiency, effectiveness of the solution. And those are true whichever market you operate in. When you're operating in cross-border rather than domestic payments, it's a much more complex situation, and the balancing between those different factors becomes much harder to get right for both the customer and for the regulatory side of things. And I think the other key dimension I mentioned is really around what are the regulatory changes and pressures that continue to evolve. And I think when you look at regulators across the world, whether it's PBOC in China or the Fed, OCC in the US, other regulators, their goals are very much the same. Their concerns primarily around money laundering, CFT. They are around fraud and consumer protection and sustainability and reliability of the financial system. So the fundamental drivers, I think, are the same. The way they operate is somewhat different. China, as a market in particular, operates at a different speed to other markets, certainly has done in the last 15, 20 years, and we've seen dramatic changes there. Continued evolution in the West, but not at the same speed. I think on the regulatory side, there are some key differences. The way in which regulations happen in China is quite different. The way the regulators have allowed and encouraged innovation in payments and financial services has been to create a framework which still leaves a lot of space which is less clearly defined within which innovation can happen. And then as the market develops, the regulators step in and shape it based on what they see evolving. And obviously we've seen that, dramatically within the B2C payment space in China and in other industries as well. I mean, I think the key thing to remember on the regulatory side is just as, China business operates at a faster speed than Western business typically, the regulators also will act at faster speed than Western regulators.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. And it's interesting that you're bringing up towards the end there that, that focus on the kind of B2C environment in China, because I think that that's, really something that is obviously front and center in terms of when people from the outside look at payments in China, they're thinking of the developments in super app platforms like WeChat and Alipay. PingPong is obviously more active in the B2B space. So how would you maybe contrast and compare the changes that have been happening in B2B versus B2C payments?
Yeah, I don't think we've probably ever seen evolution and innovation as fast as it's happened in the B2C space in China, anywhere in the world. And one of the key factors, a couple of key factors that shaped that. One was obviously it was starting from what was a largely cash-based domestic payment situation. So it was a greenfield site. So when new technology came in, it was able to do it without a lot of legacy systems and options available. So it was a open white space. And so the innovation happened very fast. Secondly, it's a huge domestic market. So when you have a good solution, that can scale incredibly quickly. And that is what we saw with Alipay, WeChat Pay in the B2C space. B2B is different. And as you say, PingPong, we are just cross-border focused, just business focused. And the starting point for B2B was different. There were solutions in place. This was typically through traditional banking systems, SWIFT, network payments. So there were legacy systems and options available. Secondly, the pace of change has been significantly slower because cross-border payments are inherently far more complex, far more risky. I touched on before the concerns around AML, CFT. It's a much more complex situation. So innovation has been slower, but it has been accelerating. And what I've seen, obviously, one of the trends in the last 15 years has been the growth of e-commerce, cross-border e-commerce, typically Chinese sellers selling on the major Western marketplaces like Amazon, eBay, Walmart, and others. But it's, and that has grown very, very quickly. And we saw with COVID that exploded. When people were having to do everything online, e-commerce basically grew 4 years in less than 1 year in terms of the volumes. But what is less noticed, I think, is the impact COVID had on B2B payments, because that is anything much more structurally significant in many ways. E-commerce was on a long-term growth trajectory already, and that has continued since COVID. With B2B payments, it really jump-started efforts to digitize cross-border B2B trade. When, foreign buyers could no longer come to the Canton Fair, do the tour of the factory, develop the business relationships and solutions in person. It has generated a real push and innovation around B2B marketplaces, digital platforms that facilitate cross-border B2B trade. And that's something we've been very active in the last 3 to 4 years.
Absolutely. Big growth in kind of wholesale e-commerce as well, definitely. Maybe just first, before turning directly to that kind of e-commerce dilemma and the kind of impact that it has on payments, maybe also I want to pick your brains on the rails point, because obviously you're quite right to say that lots of the transfers here are still happening through very traditional rails like SWIFT, How do you see maybe new technology affecting that kind of transfer? You know, obviously we're living in a kind of DLT world now, potentially with stable coins kind of emerging. Do you think that has an impact on the kind of speed and efficiency of those cross-border transactions?
Yes, I think I would highlight a couple of things. First is, actually within the SWIFT network, there has been very, very significant innovation. I mean, when you look at SWIFT GPI and the speed at which payments are credited to the beneficiary, it's a dramatic improvement on where SWIFT was 5 to 10 years ago. I think the challenge here with GPI is that there's a link between speed and transparency, because GPI may complete its portion of the transfer very, very quickly, but it's also dependent on the receiving bank in terms of how fast their processes make those funds available to the beneficiary. And so this is where I think, you know, SWIFT maybe doesn't get as much credit as it should for the innovations it's made, because it's not necessarily transparent to the beneficiary where that final delay is happening. So SWIFT is evolving fast, which is great to see. I think what we're also seeing is the rise of domestic real-time payment solutions. And that's whether that's SEPA Inst, TIPS in Europe, whether that's FedNow in the US. And I think there are now up to almost 70 real-time payments, domestic systems in place around the world. And so where you're doing cross-border payments, you have the opportunity to leverage local payments on both ends. And if you have a global network like ours, you can, you know, we've been doing real-time payments actually for quite a few years, or close to real-time payments for quite a few years, just using the domestic innovations that have happened. Yeah. So I think that's the second area where there's been significant change and a lot more opportunity to take advantage of. And then I think on the DLT side, I think there are two ways to look at this. One is stable coins, as you say. I mean, I think I'll put crypto on one side as not really it's more of a speculative asset arena rather than a payments tool. But it's, you know, if you stick within the fiat world, stable coins are a very interesting technology. Penetration is still relatively low. I think just under 5% right now are leveraging stable coins. But I think there is definitely a role for stable coins as we go towards the future, where we will see central bank digital currencies evolving, but that will take time. And I think stable coins have a role to play during this transition period. But what I am seeing that's really starting to have an impact around DLT is not so much stable coins themselves. It is around leveraging DLT technology internally within global banks and payments institutions. And so talking with some of our major banking partners, we work with Citi, JP Morgan, most of the tier one banks around the world. And it's very interesting to see how they have invested significantly in purely internal DLT technology. And very innovative, great efficiencies in terms of treasury and real-time liquidity management on a global basis. But that's not being exposed to the customers as a DLT or stablecoin solution. It's just providing those benefits of the banks and payment companies like us putting those capabilities in place internally. And I think that's where we will see visible improvements in speed and efficiency of cross-border payments and treasury management in the short term. Stablecoins gradually evolving and taking a larger role. And ultimately, I think, yes, we'll look to central bank digital coins playing a more significant role.
So primarily an operational efficiency in the first instance, with maybe some longer term developments to come later. Coming back to that e-commerce point, I thought you were making a very interesting point also around, you know, the fact that both in the wholesale and the retail markets, essentially transactions are being carried out more and more online, and obviously that leads to, you know, greater possibilities for cybercrime, for phishing, for online fraud, and so on. So how do you see dynamics potentially, evolving in that kind of space?
Yeah, there is a tension here. As you know, as the payment networks evolve, the technology evolves. You do get this incredible improvement in speed of payments. Along with that, you know, instant payments equals instant fraud, and so it is a major risk. I think in the US last year, about 50% of all fraud was authorized push payment fraud. And it's a double-edged sword. You know, real-time payments are great solution, but they require greater investment in tools to verify that you're managing the fraud risk. And there's a trade-off there between the customer experience and actually managing the fraud risk and also the AML risk, which is front and center for any cross-border payments or financial institution. I think 99% of regulatory fines in the last year were for AML issues. So what we have to do is find ways to leverage new technologies faster than the fraudsters leverage the power of the new technologies for real-time payments. And I think we're seeing some interesting things with verification of payee or confirmation of payee, as it's called in different regions. The UK has gone live with that now as a requirement as of October this year. Europe is moving in that direction as well. Australia, the Fed now, the US is moving, I think will move in that direction, but without the same regulatory force behind it, it appears in the short to medium term. And I think some of these tools are very useful to use. And certainly what we're looking to as we operate around the world is even though these new safeguards are developed for a domestic market and primarily developed for a consumer protection rather than a B2B scenario, is how we can actually tap into those in all the countries where we operate locally and connect the dots between them. So that if we've got operating on both sides and we've got those tools available, we can provide better solutions to our customers. And I think the key here is digitization creates greater risk. These provide opportunities for fraud, but also as you digitize, you get access to more data. And managing risk is all about data. The more data you have, the better you're able to manage the risk. And so that's a big push, I think, for us and for everyone operating in this space is how can we not just execute payments, but integrate broader data sets to help us manage the risk around those payments. And that's, we look for a range of data sources, continually looking to invest in connecting new data sources to help us with that. And recognize that, real-time payments from a consumer point of view and consumer expectation really does mean real time. People want that ping, yes, money received instantly. When it comes to business, I think there is more leeway. And I think businesses recognize cross-border payments have these risks. The amounts involved are far higher than the smaller consumer transactions. And they're willing to accept, even if payments are not exactly real time, they are fast. And particularly, as I mentioned before, where there is a link with transparency. I think the frustration and the challenges around traditional cross-border payments was not just the amount of time, but the lack of real transparency as to where the payment was in the process. And I think if we can focus on transparency as a key objective related to speed and managing expectations, providing that sense of where the payment is in the process, that allows some leeway in really being real time, which our business customers will accept, and they value the reliability and the protections that come from putting those extra safeguards in place. And it's going to be a question of keeping that balance right, taking advantage of new technologies as we go forward. And I think the other thing that I obviously can't avoid mentioning is AI and machine learning. And this is something that, again, it's a double-edged sword because it can be used to generate deep fakes. It can be a very powerful tool for fraud, but also obviously it's a hugely powerful tool for us and other payments, financial institutions in how do we identify risks, both real-time transaction monitoring, post-transaction monitoring, pattern recognition, to actually target our efforts where there is risk. And allow, based on having enough data, allow the clean, low-risk transactions to go through very fast, very seamlessly, but put very good controls in place where there really is the need to focus.
Well, David, we're almost out of time, so maybe just one last question, which is, I think, reflective of all of what you've been saying today, which is, throughout your dialogue, you've been talking about the need for ever-increasing speed to the point of real-time real-time settlement, essentially, the need for greater sort of security, transparency on where it is in the transaction, and then also the need for greater interconnectedness across borders and increasing numbers of markets. And all of these sort of seem to intersect, but have certain amounts of tension between, how do you get all of these to progress at exactly the same kind of rate? Do you think there's kind of like a way out of this conundrum, or a way of kind of squaring the circle of fast, safe and global payments? Is there something the community of people in your industry can kind of do together, perhaps?
Yeah, I think there is. I think, first of all, within those conundrum, as you say, how do you balance these factors? I think the first thing is to not overemphasize truly real-time payments. It is about very, very fast payments. And safety first, and the fastest possible within what are safe margins is probably the starting point that we all need to recognize. It is not a consumer payment with that absolutely real-time completion. I think the key is, I mentioned in terms of the verification of payee type examples, the key is things are being developed in a patchwork. Every country, every regulator, central bank is developing their regulations, their way of doing things. And the key is, how do we move towards more shared data standards, more shared frameworks, or ways to connect these capabilities, which are rightly being developed on a domestic basis first. And I think this is where it is the private sector, global payments companies and banks who can come together and start developing solutions that connect the dots between data sets, data tools that are available to manage risk, and create more of a common framework, which is in all of our interests in terms of serving our customers better.
So I think that's a great sort of note to leave it on then, in that case, a strong business-led move towards international harmonization of standards around payments. David, thank you so much for joining us today. And back to you, Judith.
Thank you so much, Chris Hollifield there and his guest, David Messenger. And we're now coming back to a topic that was already touched upon by both our previous panels, the one making a case for buying a China-focused fund and the one giving us some ideas about Chinese outbound investments and the latest developments. And both refer to green finance. Now, taking a step back, let's remember that the Chinese government has set a 30-60 dual carbon goal. What does it mean? It means reaching a carbon peak before 2030 and carbon neutrality before 2060. And therefore, the Chinese government attaches great importance to the role of finance in this transition. That's why it put in place a multi-tiered green finance market with a green lending and a green bond market currently valued at about $5 trillion, making it one of the world's largest. And in fact, in 2023, China was once again the world's largest green bond market for the second year in a row. That's according to the Climate Bond Initiative. Now, at the same time, China has been quite proactive and vocal in the international dialogue on green finance around aligning frameworks and standards and generally scaling up cross-border green finance flows. And you may know the leading example for that is the Common Ground Taxonomy, also known as CGT, between China and the European Union. And more recently, efforts center around, for example, transition finance, biodiversity risk, and also disclosure standards. So, for the latest on the progress to net zero and ways to speed up mutual developments on green finance, I have the pleasure now to welcome our moderator for our final panel, Paul Chahine. Paul serves as Sustainable Finance Manager at the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, which is, of course, a home of the Luxembourg Green Exchange, the globe's leading platform for green, sustainable, and social securities. Now, in addition to contributing to projects at the Luxembourg Green Exchange, Paul is also in charge of daily management of the LGX Academy, the Sustainable Finance Education arm of the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, where he serves as a lead lecturer. Now, Paul also oversees sustainable finance partnerships and capacity building programs with partners in emerging economies, international organizations, and governments. And I happen to know He was several times in China to that effect in this role to teach over there. And he also represents Luxembourg Stock Exchange in several international fora and contributes to several working groups, including those formed by the ICMA, the United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, and the World Federation of Exchanges. And before joining the LGX team in November 2019, Paul served over at the European Investment Bank, where he played a pivotal role in climate finance tracking and methodology. So, welcome. Great to have you with us here as moderator for this panel, Paul, with your rich expertise. And I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Judith, for your introduction, and to Luxembourg for Finance for inviting me to take part in this forum in its 2024 edition. Financial institutions, including those represented today with us, play a crucial role in the transition journey that Judith has just mentioned. They have the power to direct capital flows towards sustainable projects and drive innovation in green financing solutions. From green bonds to transition finance, they can set the standards that differentiate green initiatives from greenwashing, making sure that capital goes where it can have the most substantial impact. They also serve as a bridge between policy and market reality, helping to implement and even shape regulatory framework like the Common Ground taxonomy. In short, financial institutions are uniquely positioned to be catalysts for China's transition to net zero economy and the world. Their role is not only to provide funding, but also to influence the standards, transparency, and accountability that will drive meaningful progress. Today, we will dive into how financial institutions are turning ambitious goals into actionable steps, the challenges they face, and the opportunities to accelerate China's and the world path to a sustainable future. To discuss all of this, I'm delighted to moderate this panel discussion with prominent panelists from prominent financial institutions joining us virtually from different parts in the world. Ms. Crystal Geng, Asia ESG Research Lead at BNP Paribas Asset Management. Ms. Hunji Li, Head of UK, China International Capital Corporation Limited. And Mr. Shiwei Liu, Chief Risk Manager, Credit Management Department at Bank of China. Welcome and thank you for joining this panel. Let's dive straight in, as I am keen to hear your thoughts on how financial institutions can speed up green finance to progress towards net zero. And allow me to start with Ms. Geng from BNP Paribas Asset Management. At BNP Paribas Asset Management, your net zero roadmap outlines your strategy for aligning your practices and portfolios with a low carbon future. You have built the net zero AAA methodology as your own tool to track your progress. Your commitment covers 50% of assets under management, and you aim to extend this to 100% in due course. This is an important example to see how financial institutions are playing their part. Can you please tell us more about your net zero investment strategy, about your ESG efforts locally in China, and how you are localizing global approach into China context?
Sure, thanks, Paul. Well, thanks again, LFF, inviting me this year to share something from the perspective of European-based asset managers, especially a large portion of our fund are domiciled in Luxembourg, and also our practice locally, such as in China. As Paul has already mentioned, like BNP Asset Management, actually we have announced the roadmap on net zero since 2021, and starting from that year, we have rolled out the firm-wise net zero initiative covering both our portfolio management, which is investment, and as well as our practice. So first of all, I just want to emphasize the target again, because that is the basic for everything. So for BNP PAM, the final net zero target is to be 2050 or sooner. And there is some like kind of the progress target by 2030 and also by 2040. So we are trying to reduce half of the portfolio emission by 2030. Of course, that is compared with the time of 2019. But actually, right now we have already achieved this kind of target. So we are very confident and also more ambitious to kind of tweak our net zero target to be more aligned with climate, with more advanced climate change target. And in details, there are a few pillars which helps an asset manager to achieve this target. I want to highlight three. The first one is you have to have a kind of very detailed methodology for your research and also for internal monitoring. The target is not only a target, you have to do something in the progress. As Paul has already mentioned, the net zero AAA is something we have developed internally. That is a proprietary scoring framework for all the issuers under our management. Basically, we give them different status, like they are aligned or achieving or not aligned to net zero target, so that we can manage our portfolio with a more like clear and like sense and also information. So this kind of a research or methodology framework is not only backward looking, because previously we can't just look at the historical carbon emission of the issuer. We also need to look forward, like taking into consideration of the issuer's commitment and also their revenue alignment, as well as their capex on renewable energy, etc. Then the second part I want to highlight is to invest on climate solutions. Our thematic funds is actually covering a good variety of things, such as the most basic thing is renewable energy. We also cover sustainable agriculture, because as we all know, agriculture is also committing quite a lot of carbon emission globally, and also into forestry area. We just acquired international woolen company. That is something quite interesting, so that we can able to provide a forestry investment and also carbon credit trading and advisory business. The last but not the least is to engage and vote on the company. So we actively vote on climate-related proposals to encourage the company. Basically, the first step is to disclose their carbon emission. Then we are also encouraging the few largest emission issuers to achieve net zero by 2050 or even sooner. As for China, while BNP, we do have a few affiliates and joint venture, such as we have one Securities asset management focusing on institutional clients right now in China. Another one is the mutual fund manager focusing on individuals. And the other one is the wealth management, which is more focused on fixed income. So all those settings really like providing us a good setting up on our business as well as our ESG integration. I can give you some example, because as a global asset manager, actually we do have quite a lot of challenges to apply the global rules. I think, Paul, you may know it very well. There is a huge gap between EU policy guideline and also China or emerging market. But we are very diligent to commit to our net zero policy, as especially on investment, as I mentioned already. But we're still taking into the local context, such as in China security, the one I just mentioned, we are using 100% of global policy because the client, they are institutional and they are more ESG sensitive, positively, so which make us be able to do that. Well, for the wealth management firm, we also cover all the investment, but we design a watch list model for the local high emitters that is supported by our local ESG analyst, so that we can perform more in-depth local research and also to engage with the company, so that make sure the company can give us a clear positive feedback within the watch list period. Thanks, Paul. Back to you.
Thank you, Ms. Geng, for your insights. Mr. Liu, I will move to you. In its November digital edition, Global Finance magazine said the Bank of China is leading the way in green finance, supporting businesses in a range of sustainable products at home and abroad. What exactly Bank of China have achieved in terms of green finance?
Okay, thank you, Paul. Actually, Bank of China has always valued green development. So, green finance is one of the top priority areas. As part of the top-level design, we have set up and continue to improve a three-tiered green finance governance structure across the board of directors, the senior management, and the teams of professional experts. Meanwhile, we are also making continuous efforts to improve the bank's policy system, which includes stimulus packages covering incentives in performance appraisal, economic capital, and allocation of personnel expenses, etc., all as a forceful support to green finance. To manage ESG risks, we have strengthened measurement from the aspects of risk identification, measurement, assessment, monitoring, and reporting, control and mitigation, etc. And we have seized to fund new coal mining and new coal-fired power projects outside the Chinese mainland since the fourth quarter of 2021. To build up capacity, the bank has set up a system to help cultivate green finance talents, which would produce about 10,000 employees with knowledge in green finance by 2025. We are an active participant of over 10 green or ESG-related initiatives, including the United Nations Principles for Responsible Banking, PRB, and the Green Investment Principles, GIP, for the Belt and Road Initiative. Thanks to the above-mentioned efforts, our green finance businesses have been enjoying fast and sound development. By the end of September 2024, our domestic green credit balance has exceeded 3.8 trillion RMB, an increase of over 30% year-on-year. It got the highest ranking among Chinese banks in the Bloomberg League Table for global green loans. We've also maintained our market leadership in green bond underwriting. Also, as an issuer, we issued such innovative bond products as the world's first sustainable development bond under the theme of jointly building Belt and Road Initiative. Bank of China will continue to innovate and optimize our green finance products and services, facilitate the carbon peaking and carbon neutrality goals. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you so much for your insight. Bank of China is one of the leading banks. We know this very well in Luxembourg. I move to Ms. Li. CICC is committed to a sustainable future and a low-carbon economy through dedicated products and services such as green bonds and carbon neutrality bonds. What can you tell us about your efforts in this field?
Actually, since the carbon neutrality goal was proposed, CICC has actively contributed to and participated in carbon neutrality and green development. We held many online forums just like this and actively participated in dialogues with the Climate Bonds Initiative, CBI, to jointly promote green finance and carbon neutrality. So, and another big part we have done is as an investment bank, we set up a carbon neutrality focused research team, conduct systematic research, build an analytical framework, and a carbon database. Embedded carbon neutral analysis to all aspects of our product development and investment strategies. And also thirdly, we assist clients to attract and access finance through bond market and connect them with investors looking for ESG investment. Just to give you an example, year to date, we have already underwrite $59 billion sustainable and green bonds. And among those landmark deals and initiatives, we also have excuse me, we also did like in 2019 as the only investment bank, CICC signed the Belt and Road Green Investment Principles with more than 20 large international institutions at the Belt and Road International Summit Forum.
Thank you. Thank you for your insight, Ms. Lee. Thank you all for this first round of questions. Let's switch maybe the discussion to transition finance. Transition finance designed to help high emission sectors and companies to reduce their carbon footprints over time, and this has become a mainstream in the last few years. While green finance typically funds projects that are already green or environmentally friendly, like renewable energy, transition finance supports industries that are not yet green, but are on a path toward lower emissions. Again, with BNP Paribas, I'm aware of a recent analysis on China industry policies, especially in the energy sector, the electricity market reform, etc. Would you like maybe to share with us more details about this and how this is linked also to transition finance?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Actually, well, as China, you know, as one of the largest carbon emission emitter, and also that is also the biggest renewable energy capacity installation country. There are really too many research papers following the national policy and also the moves. But I think there are really something quite interesting we just noticed recently. One is regarding transition. Then the second one is regarding like the direction of how the renewable energy part is going. Then maybe start with the transition. Well, you know, like for the debate between EU and China is how China, it's not only China, but also India and also the other emerging market, how those countries can really transit, how those coal-fired power plant can really transit. But there, I really noticed that in June, China has actually published the low carbon renovation action plan for their coal-fired power plant. The period is just is quite recent. It's not like a long-term target, which like I think most of the external stakeholders, they don't have a really sense. This one is quite near. It's from 2024 to 2027. So as is mentioned, by 2027, so the newly built low carbon coal-fired renovation project, they should have a 50% lower compared with the average level of the similar unit type in 2023. So within 4 years, they are targeting to reduce like half of the emission, which is really very impressive and hardly to believe. But we believe, like in China, since China has such a strong manufacturing, all the renewable energy infrastructure, as well as the machinery, as well as the technology. So, so that is something really impressed us and make us to have more confidence on the transition activities from China. Of course, that will be supported by a lot of the transition finance coming from the other relevant regulators and agencies. The other one is not about transition from the coal-fired power plant or side is more on the renewable, because we all know like China has been built the renewable capacity in a very large scale from like more than a decade ago. But now we noticed the last month NDRC has a new regulation. It's called the new renewable energy directive. That is just the last month. The focus is actually shifting from building renewable power generation capacity to emphasizing on the more coordinated and also secure renewable energy system, and to prioritize the consumption of the actually renewable energy. Especially they have mentioned some key sectors like industrial, building, infrastructure, and also transportation. So I think that really has impressed not only me, but also my European colleagues a lot. As China is finishing its the 14th five-year plan, and we are approaching the 15th five-year plan. And also we have noticed the greenhouse gases may peak before 2025, which is way ahead of the official timeline, which is 2030. So we are looking forward to seeing more stable and also very positive policy support.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your insight, Ms. Geng. I'll switch to Ms. Lee from CICC. You have just mentioned actually previously that year to end 2024, you underwrite USD 59 billion in sustainable and green bonds. And we know that these instruments, actually debt instruments in general, represent a promising tool to finance the transition. What can you tell us more about these instruments and its advantages?
Yeah, I would say one of the biggest attraction is to access diverse and high quality global investors. For example, the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, and other reputable international organizations they all regard ESG or sustainable investing as one of the most important factors in bond investment. Well-known investment houses like BlackRock and AIA have also enlarged their sustainable investment mandates. Diversification of the investor base provides greater stability for a company's continued public marketing financing. Also, we notice the enlarged investor base and potentially stronger demand to push down pricing. Many international investing institutions have dedicated asset portfolios in investing in sustainable green bonds. This increased the demand for newly issued bonds that meet such criteria. With a wider pool of investors, demand for such bonds can increase greatly, creating book tension to potentially drive down the pricing and make the pricing competitive. Thank you.
Thank you for your insight. Mr. Liu, from your point of view, in the realm of transition finance, what are the prospects of EU and China collaboration on green and on transition finance?
Okay, well, I think that from a historical perspective, China-Europe Green Finance Cooperation has a very robust foundation. Both China and the EU were early pioneers in green finance policy and market practices. To date, China-EU cooperation in green finance has also yielded substantial results. In recent years, entities like Hungary's government and Mercedes-Benz have issued green panda bonds in China, and the Luxembourg Stock Exchange and the Shenzhen Stock Exchange jointly launched the green bond indices. And additionally, China and the EU have collaborated on international green finance initiatives, producing documents such as the G20 Sustainable Finance Roadmap and the Common Ground Taxonomy to further their cooperation. Given this foundation, the prospects for further China-EU green finance collaboration are promising. The two sides can enhance cooperation in several ways. First, by advancing mutual recognition of standards to foster connectivity between their green finance markets. Second, by promoting the two-way opening of green finance markets to diversify funding sources and participants. And third, by leveraging international platforms to broaden cooperative channels and deepen collaboration in third-party green finance markets. Transition finance is an extension and a complement to green finance. And in recent years, there has been a growing international consensus on this development. The G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group has identified the establishment of a transition finance framework as one of its key agenda items. China is also actively promoting the development of standards and product innovation in transition finance. China and the EU can strengthen their cooperation in this area and work for consensus on the scope, development pathways, product standards, and regulatory policies for transitional economic activities, establishing a first-mover advantage in the field of transition finance. As an active participant in the green finance market, Bank of China will continue to provide more resource support to our branches in Europe, encourage their active participation in green and low-carbon projects, and enhance cooperation with the European peers. Thank you. Back to you, Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Yu. That was a great introduction, actually, for our last subject that we'll discuss during this panel, the EU-China collaboration. And you have mentioned very clearly the EU-China Common Ground taxonomy that has been put in place and has been around now for 3 years. And as of May 2023, 230 Chinese green bonds were identified as aligned with this new taxonomy, let's put it like this, in comparison with 193 in July 2023. So how at BNP Paribas, again, you are tackling investing in sustainable instrument in general and maybe in CGT aligned instruments?
Well, from our perspective, we do use some like takeaway from the CGT, but as fundamentally, we do have our own proprietary assessment framework for all the sustainable fund, green or social. So under this methodology, we are covering no matter corporate issuer or sovereign issuer. We know like a third party or second party opinion, they are quite informative, but we still want to like make sure our assessment is aligned with our own methodology to try to avoid the like uncertainties or some greenwashing risk. So from our perspective, we really like we look at the public material, and often we do have the communication, the direct communication with brokers, such as BOC or CSCC or whatever, and also directly we hope to arrange some meeting with the issuers, which really help us to understand more. And the methodology is actually very aligned with EU taxonomy, but with some extra criteria because we want to leverage our other internal ESG framework as well to be more consistent internally because our asset is not only about bond but also equity and the other multi-assets. Well, back to China and EU, the joint part, I think the GC, the common ground taxonomy really helps us to zoom in the pool. Such as the catalog for the existing bond released last year by the working group. On top of that, there are also something like both European asset manager and China can try to explore. I give you an example is our joint venture, the wealth management firm. They are working on a thematic bond fund this year, and they are actually assessing the possibility to take the CBI resilience taxonomy into China to assess the LGFV. So I think that is also like a good try to bring this two like regions together. So we hope like although BNP is not the top 10 or even we are not top 20 in terms of the AUM among all asset manager. But we are the top 10 asset manager who is investing on sustainable bond. So we hope we can dedicate more like resources and also fund towards the sustainable bond. But then under the condition, the bond can be verified under our own framework. So that is our answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your answer. On the international level, actually, the ICMA principles, the CBI standards, and other schemes are commonly used for thematic bond issuances, as we all know. How do you see this at the CICC, Ms. Lee? How do these standards actually being employed and maybe adapted to the local Chinese issuer?
So I will just first of all briefly introduce the commonly used international standards. As mentioned, there are two, right? One is ICMA, the other one is climate bonds. ICMA, namely, is the International Capital Market Association. It's like the green bond principles. It has been developed by ICMA. The short name is GPB, and it also has the social bond principles, SBP, the sustainability bond guidelines, SBG, and the sustainability linked bond principles, SLBP. They collectively called the principles, have become the leading framework globally for the issuance of sustainable bonds. Assessments are largely based on the use of proceeds, project evaluation, and selection process, management of proceeds, information disclosure, and reporting post-issuance. Now, talking about climate bonds. So this is like issued by the Climate Bonds Initiative, CBI, in 2011. Climate bond standards, CBS, aims to improve the investment efficiency of low carbon projects and to promote development of low carbon economy. CBI published detailed industrial standards and technical matrix in order to, in relation to the specific operation process. Now, like I would like to talk more under climate bonds, right? So, like climate bonds also developed climate bond certification. So CBS and certification scheme aim to provide the confidence and assurance needed to expand the green bond market. Proper identification of green bonds is key to promoting the development of green bond markets in mainstream deal markets to finance and refinance climate change-related projects in order to achieve global climate goals. As mentioned in the beginning, those kind of standards help the real green bonds projects rather than greenwashing. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these insights. Another aspect for the EU-China collaboration is on biodiversity protection. Both regions have committed to protecting ecosystems, promoting sustainable development, and aligning biodiversity goals. What can you tell us about this specific subject, Mr. Liu?
Okay. We believe that the COP15 to the Convention on Biological Diversity marked a milestone with the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Yet, a very large funding gap is estimated at $700 billion US annually, continues to hinder biodiversity conservation efforts, especially in developing countries with very limited resources. To address this, China launched the Kunming Biodiversity Fund with an initial investment of 1.5 billion RMB in May this year, taking a leading role in supporting global biodiversity efforts. Chinese financial institutions are also advancing biodiversity protection through innovative financial policies, products, and enhanced management and disclosure of biodiversity-related risks. For instance, Bank of China issued the world's first biodiversity-themed green bond in 2021, raising 1.8 billion RMB, followed by another deal about $400 million biodiversity-themed green bond in 2022. And additionally, we introduced China's first commercial ESG-linked loan with a focus on nature benefits. With the international presence, we also engaged in global biodiversity discussions and co-signed a statement with other financial institutions to support biodiversity protection. As the biodiversity loss intensifies, collaboration between China and Europe is essential, particularly in mobilizing financial resources. Financial institutions in both regions can play a key role by integrating biodiversity into investment and lending practices. Through green finance initiatives, we can direct more capital towards conservation projects, sustainable agriculture, and renewable energy, which help preserve natural ecosystems. Europe and the Chinese banks, investment funds, and public financial institutions can establish joint funds and collaborate on biodiversity-focused bonds and grants. Together, we can create frameworks that assess and reduce the environmental impact of investments. By sharing best practices and setting aligned standards, we can channel financial resources into projects that protect biodiversity while promoting sustainable economic growth. This partnership in biodiversity conservation can serve as a model for global financial institutions, paving the way for a future where economic development and biodiversity protection go hand in hand. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We cannot agree more on the importance of protecting biodiversity. Well, ladies and gentlemen, with that, our time panel has drawn to a close. Thank you to our esteemed panelists from China International Capital Corporation, BNP Paribas Asset Management, and Bank of China for such an insightful discussion. Today, we have explored the critical role that financial institutions play in driving China's and the world's transition to net zero, from the development of green bonds and transition finance to the alignment of global standards with initiatives like the Common Ground Taxonomy. It's clear that the financial sector is more than just a participant in this journey. It's a catalyst for meaningful change. To our audience, thank you for watching us today. I hope you leave inspired by the momentum we are building and energized to take part in this transition. Together we can and must advance progress toward net zero, not just as a financial imperative, but as a responsibility to future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul Chahine, there with his fantastic panel speakers, giving us truly an idea about the expansion and evolution of green finance in China. Now, with that, the China Finance Forum 2024 is gently drawing to a close. We hope that the insights and the information provided by our speakers are of value to you. As you know, with this format, we strive to contribute to the understanding around investing in China and doing business in China and with China. And we will seek to continue the conversation at another time. For now, we encourage you to revisit the replay. The email with the link should be with you shortly. Also, if you want to learn about other events Luxembourg for Finance is putting on, or just connect with the team, this is where you can find Luxembourg for Finance on social media, on LinkedIn, on Instagram, and also on X. For today, on behalf of Luxembourg for Finance, we thank our sponsors and our media partner, the Financial Times. We thank our speakers for sharing their rich expertise with us. And we thank all of you for watching and listening. It's been a privilege to be with you. Also, heartfelt gratitude goes out to our production team behind the scenes here at the European Broadcasting Centre. And for me, it remains to say thank you, goodbye, and until next time, 再见.